Get involved, you must tell us the truth.
I'm not involved. I'm telling you that. I'm not involved.
Well, why should somebody put you there?
I don't know. I've been telling you over and over. That's what I'm saying. I don't know. I don't know what they put me in it for.
For days, police searched for Lynette White, a witness for the prosecution in 2 separate trials. They assumed she was just laying low. That was until they made a forced entry into her apartment. And there she was, not laying low, but lying dead. What happened to Lynette White? Welcome back to Mysterious 7, where we shed light on under-the-radar cases from across the globe. Without further ado, let's get into it. Lynette White was a beautiful young woman from Cardiff, Wales, who was doing what she believed she had to do in order to get by. She dropped out of school and had been working as a prostitute since she was 14. Being a sex worker wasn't part of Lynette's childhood dream. Weeks before she was found dead, Tim Rogers, a BBC Wales journalist, interviewed her while investigating child prostitution. During the interview, she told Tim how she was drugged, taken to Bristol by a gang of men, and forced into prostitution. Yet even after Lynette found her way back to Cardiff, she could not find her way out of prostitution. By 1988, Lynette, who was now 20 years old, was working the streets daily as a prostitute. Described as popular and pretty by friends, Lynette was probably the most visible prostitute working in Cardiff at the time. She was the first girl to be out at lunchtime and would be the last to leave at night. Working every day, rain or shine, even on Christmas, earning £100 per night. One would almost think White was working hard to have a better life. But that was not the case. It was all to pay for her boyfriend, Stephen Miller's cocaine addiction. Every night, Miller took £60 to £90 from Lynette, who was his only source of income. Lynette lived with Miller in a flat on Dorset Street in Cardiff. Each day, Miller would drive her to Riverside in Cardiff, where she worked, and meet her later in the evening at the North Star Club to collect her earnings. It continued like that every day until February 9th, 1988 was the last day Miller saw Lynette. She had not made contact with Miller or her friends in the days leading up to her death, which was very odd behavior for her. She was also due to make an appearance as a witness for 2 prosecution trials when she disappeared. No one knows the reason why White stopped contacting others 5 days prior to her death. The police thought she was deliberately hiding to avoid giving evidence and began to actively search for her. Earlier that same month, Leanne Vilday, Lynette's friend, had loaned Lynette her keys to a flat for the purpose of taking clients there for sex. On February 14th, 1988, in the evening, Leanne, who probably wanted to use the flat, went there but found it locked, which was quite unusual. Lynette was nowhere to be found. Leanne became very worried about Lynette. She drove to Buttetown Police Station to report her friend's disappearance. She returned to her James Street flat with 3 policemen who were expecting to serve an arrest warrant on Lynette and take her in. The policemen forced entry into the apartment and found Lynette lying there, in a pool of her own blood. A missing witness found dead with massive injuries. Who murdered Lynette White? According to the autopsy performed by pathologist Bernard Knight, Lynette had been stabbed over 50 times on her chest, face, stomach, wrist, breasts, arms, hands, and inner thighs. Her throat was also savagely slit from ear to ear. Though she was stabbed multiple times, the autopsy revealed that Lynette died from the throat injury. The pathologist also determined that Lynette was murdered on February 14th between 1:45 a.m. and 4:00 a.m. Lynette's body was found between the foot of the bed and the window, covered in blood. Azoospermic semen, which is semen containing no sperm, was found in her vagina and also on her underwear. There were 2 different blood types found on Lynette, her own blood and an AB type blood, which did not belong to Lynette. Soon the news about Lynette's death had spread, and police began to ask questions about the incident. Witnesses told the police that they saw a man looking distressed in the area where Lynette's body was found on James Street. The man looked very suspicious, and he appeared to have blood on his hands. The suspicious man, described as a white male, approximately 5'8" to 5'10", and in his mid-30s, became the primary focus of the investigation. Efforts to find this man were exhaustive. Soon they arrested a man that matched the suspect's description, but he was soon released after he presented his alibi. Police looked into Miller, Lynette's boyfriend, as the partner of a murder victim is usually the first obvious suspect. Miller was questioned but later released because his blood type didn't match the one found on Lynette. Because Lynette was supposed to appear as a witness against a man named Francine Cordell in court, Francine and his mother were investigated, but soon the two were eliminated as suspects because their blood also did not match the AB blood type found on Lynette. Very little is known about the case against Cordell or the other case that Lynette was set to give evidence in. Another suspect that piqued the investigators' interest was a man who was on a list of 12 persons of interest in the area due to their past criminal activity. He was a sex offender and a pedophile who lived close to James Street. His identity was concealed, and he was called Mr. X. When Mr. X was interviewed, he admitted to paying Lynette for sex in the past and was unable to account for his whereabouts at the time of the murder. Mr. X had blood type AB, which prompted the police to run a DNA test on him. When the results came back, it eliminated Mr. X from the investigation. Now, all that the police were left with were statements gathered from their door-to-door inquiry. Gromick, who lived in the flat right above where Lynette was murdered, together with his friend Atkins, gave statements implicating each other in their accounts. But as the statements contained 4 completely different accounts, the investigators didn't take it seriously. Ronnie Williams, a police informant, also gave an account implicating his common-law brother-in-law, Yusef Abdullahi. He initially claimed Abdullahi knew the killer and later implicated him directly, saying Abdullahi was the killer. It was known to the police that the two detested each other, so again, investigators dismissed the account. Leanne Vilday, who reported Lynette's disappearance on the day she died, was also suspected and questioned. The police visited her daily to question her. The pressure was becoming too much for her to handle, and one day, while she was drunk, she named Miller and Abdullahi as the killers. Violet Perriam, a secretary at a Cardiff yacht club, also gave a statement about the incident. 8 months into the investigation, she came forward claiming that on February 14th, while driving home from the club at about 1:30 a.m., she saw 4 excited black males outside the building where Lynette was killed. She then identified 2 of them as John Actie and Rashid Omar. Perriam's statement would give the case a new direction. Angela Sala, who is mildly mentally retarded, also gave a statement that she saw Miller, John, Rashid, Ronnie Acton, John's cousin, Tony Paris, and Tony Brace outside 7 James Street on the day Lynette was murdered. This was exactly what police needed, as her account corroborated Perriam's statement. Further implicating Abdullahi, John, Miller, and the rest were Gromick and Atkins, who gave new statements on the same day with Sala. They said they also saw a group of men, including Ronnie and Abdullahi. Sala then gave another statement in December 1988 that she heard a scream from Lynette's flat and rushed there with Vilday. Coincidentally, on the same day, Vilday also told the police that she went to the flat after she heard Lynette scream and met Miller, Abdullahi, Ronnie Actie, Miller's brother, and an unnamed mixed-race man. Unfortunately for Sala, she had an AB blood type. Police insisted that her blood was found on Lynette's socks. She then gave a new statement that she was part of the killing together with Vilday and the other guys. Vilday also admitted that she was forced to cut Lynette's wrist to ensure her complicity and silence. Miller confessed to killing Lynette after 307 denials. He also implicated the other men named, which led to the arrest of all the men allegedly involved in the murder. On December 7, 1988, the police arrested Stephen and Tony Miller, Youssef Abdullahi, Ronnie Akhti, Rashid Omar, and Martin Tucker. On December 9, 1988, John Akhti and Tony Paris were also arrested. For close to a year, they were locked up until their trial began on October 5, 1989, at Swansea Crown Court. This trial became the longest murder trial in British legal history, lasting 197 days. After spending 2 years in custody, Ronnie and John Akhti were acquitted of the murder, while Tony Paris, Stephen Miller, and Youssef Abdullahi were found guilty. Each were sentenced to life imprisonment, and since then they're known as the Cardiff Three. Even though no forensic evidence linked these men to the crime scene, they were held as the criminals. However, there were a lot of doubts and questions about the convictions. Consequently, the friends and families of the Cardiff Three began a campaign to overturn the convictions. The campaign received massive support and was followed by television documentaries in 1992. By December 1992, the Cardiff Three's appeal was heard. After the Court of Appeal had listened to Miller's interrogation, Lord Taylor said the police had bullied Miller during the interview.
If you're involved, you must tell us the truth.
I'm not involved. I'm telling you that. I'm not involved.
Well, why should somebody put you there?
I don't know. I've been telling you over and over. I don't listen. That's what I'm saying. I don't know. I don't know what they put me in it for.
Therefore, the truthfulness of Miller's admission was irrelevant. The Cardiff Three were free at last. Their convictions were declared unsafe and unsatisfactory by Lord Taylor. But if the Cardiff Three didn't commit the crime, it means the real criminal was still roaming free. It brings us to yet the same question. Who murdered Lynette White? 8 years later, the case was reopened. This time, Professor Dave Barkley and Chief Superintendent Kevin O'Neill were assigned to the task. The case took the officers back to the crime scene. By then, it was already 12 years since the incident happened. While examining the old crime scene photographs, Professor Barkley's eyes caught something that no one else saw in all these years. It was a large drop of blood believed to have been thrown from a knife onto the wallpaper. When the crime was committed in 1988, police removed lots of wallpaper in the flat to be stored as evidence. Upon searching through the old wallpaper evidence, they discovered that the only missing piece of wallpaper was the one that contained the large drop of blood. The forensic scientist didn't give up, though. He continued to study the crime scene photos and realized the blood could have dropped on the skirting board beneath. Underneath several layers of paint, the team found the blood completely sealed in and dry. Traces of the blood were also found on a piece of cellophane wrapper from a cigarette pack. Since then, the detectives and scientists dubbed the suspect Cellophane Man. The forensics team, led by Angela Gallup, got to work. But shockingly, the DNA profile was not found in any of the 140 police databases. But when the police searched for similar profiles, it was narrowed to just hundreds in the Cardiff area. Using the approach of familial DNA searching, a partial match was eventually made with the profile of a 14-year-old boy. This boy was known to the police as he was once arrested for joyriding in Cardiff. But could he be the Cellophane Man? If you thought about his age, then your guess was right. He wasn't even born when the incident happened. At that time, the case was 15 years old. Notwithstanding, the police had to visit his house. When they got there, they were told that the boy's father was dead, but he had an uncle, Jeffrey Gaffour. On February 26, 2003, detectives pulled up at Jeffrey's home, a semi-detached house in the village of Llanharan, 15 miles west of Cardiff, but no one was home. The following day, they checked at Jeffrey's place of work, an office block in Cardiff city centre where he worked as the security guard. When the police explained the reason for their visit, Jeffrey said, "Oh, I thought you got some guys for that." He was asked to provide a mouth swab, and he complied. Immediately, police checked the swab. They had finally caught the Cellophane Man. Chief Superintendent Kevin O'Neill was determined to do things right this time. He put a surveillance team on Jeffrey while he made preparations for the interview. Chief O'Neill had plans to put surveillance on Jeffrey for a whole week, but on February 28, 2003, Jeffrey made a crazy move. The surveillance team spotted him at a garage where he bought 3 packets of paracetamol, an over-the-counter pain reliever. By the time the police got to Jeffrey's house, he had taken about 62 paracetamols. Jeffrey denied ever taking those tablets, but he announced, "Just for the record, I did kill Lynette White. I've been waiting for this for 15 years. Whatever happens, I deserve it. I sincerely hope to die." He was taken to the hospital where he told a staff member that he was being watched because of a murder he committed 15 years ago. Jeffrey was prepared to die as he initially refused to be treated. He eventually agreed to take an antidote. Within a few days, he had recovered. On July 4, 2003, Jeffrey pleaded guilty to Lynette White's murder, and the judge, Justice Royce, sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 12 years and 8 months. Jeffrey's barrister said Jeffrey killed Lynette over 30 pounds for sex. He said Jeffrey wanted his money back when he changed his mind. In February 2007, Atkins, Sela, Vilde, and Gromek were charged with perjury. By December 2008, Sela, Vilde, and Gromek were found guilty and sentenced to 18 months of imprisonment each. Atkins was exempted because it was believed that he was bullied, threatened, abused, and manipulated to admit to false accounts suggested to him. In March 2009, it was announced that there was enough evidence to prosecute the police officers involved in the initial investigation with conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. In 2011, the trial collapsed due to missing evidence. In 2015, 8 of the 15 charged officers cleared of perverting the course of justice launched a high court civil action against the force, suing for malicious prosecution, false imprisonment, and misfeasance. But at the end of 2015, the judge in the civil action dismissed their case. The 5 falsely accused men were compensated after their release. Stephen Miller was paid £571,000. John Actie was paid £300,000, while Tony Paris was paid £250,000. Ron Actie died in 2007 after much struggle to cope with what had happened to him. Yusuf Abdullahi also died in 2011 of perforated cancer. He too had battled with post-traumatic stress disorder. On December 10, 1976, 81-year-old World War I veteran George Clarence Seitz left his house to get a nice haircut in a nearby barbershop in Jamaica, Queens. The old man mysteriously vanished into thin air, leaving behind no clues. Where did he go after leaving the house? What could have happened to him after setting out to do a harmless daily chore? The answer to these questions would remain a mystery for 4 decades. Today's story takes us to Jamaica, a small neighborhood in the New York City borough of Queens. Jamaica offers a vibrant tinge of authenticity. Being one of the most ethnically diverse counties of Queens, New York, Jamaica was the longtime home of a solitary World War I veteran named George Clarence Seitz. 81-year-old Seitz, who went by Clarence, was a dedicated soldier who fought for his country in his youth during World War I. Once retired, he preferred to keep his life private and lived alone in a nice home. Though it seemed from the outside that the war veteran lived his life on his own terms, Seitz's life was not free from complications. Just like thousands of others, the vulgar brutality of war had a lasting impact on him. Seitz developed severe PTSD and paranoia due to his time serving in the military. He was extremely reclusive and did not trust anybody. He would regularly dress up in business attire as if he were heading out for an office. Instead, he'd just roam around the neighborhood. The situation was so bad that Seitz did not even trust banks and routinely kept wads of cash on him whenever he set foot outside his house. He'd pull out a large roll of cash when it came time to pay for something. Despite this, his mental faculties were intact. The elderly Seitz never overlooked his daily chores. He was a man of discipline. His clothes were always clean and crisp. his house always clean, his hair always cut, and he presented an all-around neat appearance. No one could ever have imagined that he'd simply disappear one day while performing such a mundane task. Around 10 a.m. on December 10, 1976, Seitz headed out to a nearby barbershop for a haircut, which was just 2.5 blocks away from his home located at 116th Street in Jamaica. That day, he did not return home, nor the next day or the day after that. He was never heard from again. It was not until 5 days had passed after Seitz's mysterious disappearance that his family reported him missing. Though authorities began their search immediately, there was not much to go on. He left absolutely no clues behind. Not a trace. Investigators could only speculate as to what could have happened to him. Deputies conducted several interviews in an attempt to glean some information, but the leads were too thin to follow up on. Authorities at the time didn't even know if he even made it to the barbershop or not. The case quickly turned cold. Over the years, the Queens County Sheriff's Office collaborated with the NYPD and FBI, making numerous efforts to solve it, but they could never unravel the mystery. After lying dormant for decades, finally there was an unexpected breakthrough which turned the case white hot. In March of 2019, a woman in her 50s called the 102nd Precinct Detective Squad to report a crime that occurred decades ago. She was an eyewitness to a horrific murder and carried the secret with her for more than 4 decades. The call was picked up by Queens South homicide detective Eric Contreras. At the time, he was just 31 years old. He'd been a cop for 9 years and a detective for 3. He was a young and dedicated detective. He was juggling multiple cases at the time, as most detectives do. Contreras was born 12 years after Seitz went missing, but he took a lot of interest in the case from the beginning. The details the woman provided sent chills down the spines of the detectives. She claimed that when she was just 11 years old, she witnessed her mother's boyfriend cutting up a body and burying the body parts in the backyard of a Queens home where she was living back in December of 1976. Although she could not identify the victim, she vividly remembered the details and gave the detectives an exact location. When asked why she stayed silent all those years, she said she was afraid of reprisals, but in the end came forward because she could no longer live with the burden. The mother's boyfriend was identified as Martin Mata, a longtime resident of Jamaica. Interestingly, Martin Mata owned a barbershop called Haircutter along with his brother, which was located on 161st Street in Jamaica. The barbershop was only in operation from the late 1970s to the 1980s. It had been the last known destination of George Seitz, who was a regular customer there. Mata was only 29 years old in 1976 when Seitz went missing. The barbershop was shut down shortly after the incident. However, detectives did not immediately connect the murder to Seitz, who went missing during the same time frame that the woman had estimated. Despite the unbelievable story, the woman's account was so detailed that they decided to begin a thorough search of the property. On March 12, 2019, the investigators raided a house at 8772 115th Street, Richmond Hill, Queens, that belonged to Martin Mata, only 2.5 miles away from the now closed barbershop. Based on the description of the witness, police focused their search for remains in the backyard guarded with a wooden fence. Cadaver dogs first scoured the backyard, and after they confirmed a location, forensic anthropologists from the Emergency Services Unit began excavating. It didn't take long for the searchers to discover partial human remains in a makeshift grave buried underneath concrete that had been poured on top of it, the exact spot where the witness had stated it would be. Unfortunately, only a pelvis and part of the torso were recovered from the scene, as the rest of the body had been dismembered at the neck, shoulders, and hips. NYPD investigators turned to genetic DNA technology to identify the victim, but there seemed to be a problem with the scenario. At the time, New York state law only allowed police to use that method when seeking to identify a suspect, not a victim. The FBI agreed to assist in the investigation since they had no such limitation under federal statute. The Queens County District Attorney's Office, along with the NYPD and the NYC FBI office, contacted Othram, an independent laboratory with expertise in genetic genealogy and DNA sequencing to identify people. The lab was asked to perform advanced DNA testing that would lead to the identity of the homicide victim. Despite the level of decomposition of the remains, Othram was able to extract DNA from the bones and develop a complete DNA profile. Unfortunately, the profile did not match anyone in the local, state, or national databases. To unfold the mystery of the victim's identity, the DNA profile was used to perform a comprehensive genealogical search and to create a family tree through genetic matches. Luckily, the result came up suggesting that the victim's family members were still living in Ohio and California. The Queens South Homicide Squad detectives Contreras and Gain immediately flew out to Ohio to speak with them. The family immediately knew that this had to do with their missing relative. They went on to tell the detectives how George Seitz had vanished after setting off to get a haircut. The question of what had happened to him had stayed with their family ever since. The body was positively identified as George Clarence Seitz from the DNA provided by his family. They also provided a picture of him as a young soldier in uniform. Upon further investigation using NYPD archives and microfiche, detectives were able to find a missing person report for George Seitz from 1976. To tighten the loose ends, an age-progressed photo was created from the picture Seitz's family provided. The witness confirmed it to be the person she saw being dismembered by Martin Motta. Finally, after over 40 years, the family had some answers. The only question that remained was the motive. It was theorized that Motta fatally stabbed Seitz in the head soon after he reached the barbershop and robbed him of $7,000 to $8,000, as he knew about his customers' habits of keeping a large sum of cash with him. People would see the money he had on him, Detective Contreras later said. The extensive investigation lasted for 2 years and spanned over 5 states since the witness first came forward. In November 2021, 75-year-old Martin Motta was arrested from a Jamaica home, where the homeowner says Motta would stay sometimes as a favor to a friend of a friend. He was brought into the Queens County District Attorney's office and arraigned on a charge of intentional murder and remanded. However, no other charges can be brought due to the expiry of the statute of limitations. In October of 2022, Motta pleaded guilty to manslaughter. He was sentenced on November 7, 2022 for 20 years in prison for the 1976 slaying. After 46 years of eluding justice, Martin Motta is being held accountable for his merciless deeds. Though it does not erase the agony Seitz's family was put through, we can only hope that the identification of the remains and the indictment of his killer will bring some peace to his loved ones. For almost 2 decades, Keith Hall hid a big secret from the world. He was a well-known pimp and a drug addict, but there was an even darker side to him that no one knew about. In 2002, Keith murdered 19-year-old Rachel Wilson, whom he had been in a toxic relationship with. A series of lies to the authorities helped him to successfully cover his tracks. But when Rachel's bones turned up several years later, it was game over for him. This story will take us to Middlesbrough, England. This town was once a farm that was home to less than 30 people. With time, the area became industrialized and more populated. Now it's famous for its football club and transporter bridge. Unfortunately, sex trafficking has also been a major problem plaguing Middlesbrough. Teenage girls as young as 16 can be found working as prostitutes. Rachel Wilson is described by her family as full of life, fun, and cheeky. It seemed as if she had her whole life ahead of her and nothing could possibly go wrong. The Rachel we remember was very happy and bubbly. She was amazing. Nicola Wilson, Rachel's younger sister, told the media, "We went everywhere together and were really close." However, meeting Keith Hall at the age of 16 would mark a turning point in her life. Keith was more than 20 years older than her. Yet, despite this, an unlikely relationship developed between the two. It was obvious from the beginning that their relationship was heading for disaster, but Rachel didn't know any better. Keith was able to take advantage of her innocence, and in no time, he introduced her to a world of hard drugs, specifically cocaine. Rachel soon became heavily dependent on the stimulant. She went from being the greatest sister ever to someone ruled by her addiction. Carl, Rachel's younger brother, said, "She always promised me she would come off the drugs though. She promised she would be off them by my 18th birthday." Rachel's life began to gradually spin out of control due to the level of influence Keith was having on her. At some point, he decided to kick things up a notch. They needed money to fund their lifestyle, and Keith saw prostitution as the perfect opportunity to bring in that money. He soon talked Rachel into selling her body for money, and because of her addiction, Rachel had no choice but to oblige. She was soon working most nights on the streets of Middlesbrough to fuel both her and Keith's drug habit. Yet despite her sacrifice, Keith still wasn't satisfied. At times, she brought in less money than he expected. Whenever this occurred, he'd become violent. Rachel was suffering both physical and emotional abuse at the hands of the man she'd chosen to trust. She was growing increasingly more afraid of him as his violent, erratic behavior continued to escalate. Rachel's family did not fail to notice the change in her. They became aware of her drug addiction and saw how it was affecting her. Physically, she was getting thinner and looking like a ghost of her former self. However, they had no idea what she was going through at the hands of Keith. She went to great lengths to hide the abuse. She was always happy, even though we knew she was struggling. Rachel was a loving daughter and an all-around cheeky teenager, Rachel's mother, Tina Wilson, said. Her family eventually sought medical help to combat her addictions. However, their intervention was a little too late. On May 30th, 2002, Rachel paid a visit to her sister, Nicola. That visit was not unusual in any way. At the time, Nicola had just given birth to a baby girl, and Rachel had been going daily to spend quality time with her sister and the new baby. The visit was just like any other. After some time well spent with her sister and niece, they said their goodbyes. That same evening, she also spent time with her mother and other family members. They all went to a fair, and by 11 p.m., Rachel went on her way. That was the last time any of her family members saw her alive. A few days later, Rachel's family were getting increasingly concerned that they hadn't heard from her. This was unlike Rachel, who, despite her lifestyle, was very close with her family. They went in search of Rachel at her apartment and other places she was known to frequent. Yet there was no sign of her. It was as if she had left town entirely. Rachel had her own flat, but she always kept in touch. Sometimes we'd wonder where she was, but she'd always turn up a couple of hours later, Nicola had later said about her sister's disappearance. Eventually, her family involved the police, and a full-scale search for the missing teenager was soon launched. Police questioned Keith and was asked about his whereabouts around the time Rachel disappeared. Keith told authorities that Rachel had run off with a man she'd met at a local fair. He maintained he had no idea what became of her after that. Unfortunately, investigators had no tangible evidence to go on. The only lead the police had was CCTV footage of Rachel. She was last seen on CCTV walking down Southfield Road, Middlesbrough. This was around 7:02 a.m. on May 31st, 2002. In the days that followed, the search for Rachel intensified, but there was still no trace of her. The search continued for 16 months, and in that period, police and Rachel's mother made several appeals to the public for information regarding Rachel's disappearance. They feared the worst, but there was really nothing to confirm that she was dead. Her entire family was thrown into a state of confusion. They had no idea what had become of their beloved Rachel. Her mother, in particular, held out hope that her daughter was out there and would make her way back home and walk through the door at any minute. "Rachel, if you see this, you know you can get in touch anytime, day or night," Tina Wilson had said in one of her appeals a few years after her daughter's sudden disappearance. In 2005, Rachel's brother, Benji Hopkins, died from an antidepressant overdose. According to the family, Benji's death had much to do with Rachel's disappearance. He and Rachel had been very close, and her sudden disappearance had taken a huge toll on his death. Benji's death was a huge blow to the family, who was left to deal with another loss. On June 27, 2012, a group of men were working on a farm located on the outskirts of Middlesbrough when they unearthed human bones. The bones were found buried in a shallow grave. Police were contacted, and they immediately set out trying to uncover the identity of the body. Rachel's family was also made aware of the development, since there was a likely chance that the remains were Rachel's. After 2 weeks, the results of the analysis carried out on the bones had come back. A police spokeswoman revealed the findings, saying, "Police have now identified the body found on farmland on the outskirts of Middlesbrough a few weeks ago and can confirm that it's that of Rachel Wilson, who went missing just over 10 years ago." Rachel's family was broken by the news. "It was a really painful couple of weeks, but I just knew it was her. Even though we had to wait, I knew it was her," Nicola said at the time her family found out that Rachel was dead and gone forever. Her brother Carl was quoted as saying, "When we were told, we were devastated. It was heartbreaking to think that she had been just a bus journey away from us that whole time." Rachel's mother, of course, was beyond devastated, but she was also somewhat relieved that her daughter had finally been found. "At last, she's coming home. That's all I ever wanted. Obviously, I wanted the circumstances to be different, and for her to be coming home alive," her mother Tina said. Preparation for Rachel's funeral was set into motion. The bereaved family received huge support from the community, and a fundraiser was even held to generate money for the funeral. Rachel was finally buried alongside her brother Benji a few months after her remains were found. Yet there were still so many questions that continued preying on the minds of investigators, as well as Rachel's family. How had Rachel met her end, and who had been her killer? The examination of Rachel's remains had not revealed anything that could have led to her death. The only thing the investigators knew was that there was no clothing where her bones had been discovered, and this meant that she had been buried naked. Temporary Detective Superintendent Paula Jewell, who had investigated Rachel's death, explained, "We couldn't establish a cause of death because the remains were just skeletal and there was no forensic evidence left at the scene." She added, "Whilst it was a significant development to find someone who'd been missing for 10 years, it didn't give us the lines of inquiry we thought we'd get." Investigators began working around the clock to uncover what had happened to Rachel. But before they could make significant progress, Rachel's father, Bernard Wilson, tragically died. This was another tragic shock for the family. All Bernard wanted was to know what had happened to his daughter, and it's devastating that he went to his grave not knowing, Tina had said about Bernard's death. In 2014, police finally made a breakthrough in the case. A suspect was named, and it was none other than Keith Hall. Keith, who was 54 at the time, was arrested and questioned regarding Rachel's death. A search of his property was also conducted, and police discovered some incriminating items. Part of what was found was a lock of Rachel's hair and a handwritten note from her. The note, which was addressed to Keith, was believed to have been written just a few hours before her disappearance. In the note, she had apologized to Keith for not making enough money. The note, together with a lock of hair, would later serve as a major piece of evidence against Keith. He was later released on bail since there was no concrete evidence to prove that he had a hand in Rachel's death. However, he remained a prime suspect in the case. Over the next couple of years, Keith became a regular visitor to the police station. Yet, each time he was asked about Rachel's death, he kept leading investigators in circles. In 2018, a special grant was provided for the investigation unit of the police department. This was done so that more efforts could be channeled towards solving Rachel's murder. In the months that followed, investigators paid visits to several sex workers who had been around at the time of Rachel's disappearance. The number of these sex workers totaled about 500. It was time-consuming work, but gradually, progress was being made. A lot of witnesses we spoke to were in the sex industry and didn't want to go back and relive some of the worst periods of their life, so it was very difficult. But thankfully, some very brave people came forward and told their story, Detective Duell recalled. Many of these witnesses pointed out the toxic relationship that had existed between Keith and Rachel. They revealed how Keith had led her into prostitution and how he was in the habit of hitting her whenever she brought in less money than expected. These acts of violence were said to sometimes leave her covered in bruises. Another witness also came forward and revealed to the police some incriminating things Keith had said right after Rachel's bones were found. According to the witness, Keith had told him that he had killed Rachel. With all of these revelations, it became more obvious to the police that Keith was the man they were looking for. their suspicion was confirmed. They knew from the start that there was something fishy about Keith, but lacked strong evidence to charge him with anything. Finally, the walls were closing in on him, and a strong case was being built up. In addition to the accounts of the witnesses, investigators also sat through several hours of CCTV footage that was recorded around the time of Rachel's disappearance. From the footage, detectives noticed a purple Vauxhall combo van moving around the Middlesbrough area. This van was believed to have been used in Rachel's murder. Upon further investigation, they were able to link the vehicle to Keith. With all this evidence, investigators were able to come up with a rough idea of how Rachel had met her end. They believed that after Rachel left her family on the day she was last seen, she'd worked throughout the night, as usual. At some point, she met up with Keith, who had been disappointed by her earnings for that day. When Keith confronted her, he resorted to his usual physical abuse. Investigators surmise that this time around, he went too far and ended up beating her to death. When he realized what he'd done, he decided that it was best to cover up his tracks. Authorities believed he waited a few days and, after the murder, loaded her lifeless body into his van and drove off to the farm where her bones were found 10 years later. This was what authorities believed anyway. It's not clear if things happened exactly that way, since Keith never gave an account of how or why he killed Rachel. In December 2019, Keith was charged with the murder of Rachel Wilson. In addition to this, he was also charged with living off of immoral earnings and perverting the course of justice, the latter due to him trying to influence a key witness to lie to the police. Despite all of the evidence that pointed to him as Rachel's killer, Keith maintained his innocence and pleaded not guilty. After this, a trial date was set for June 3, 2020, but due to the coronavirus pandemic, it was shifted to October 6th that same year. The trial date was once again changed until May 11, 2021 was finally agreed upon. On the day his trial was due to start, Keith finally confessed that he was responsible for Rachel's death. He denied the charge of murder, but pleaded guilty to manslaughter, which was a lesser charge. He also pleaded guilty to the other 2 charges brought against him. After his admission of guilt, a spokesperson for the Crown Prosecution Service, which is responsible for prosecuting criminal cases, spoke to the media about the reasons why Keith's plea for manslaughter was accepted. He revealed that the case had been an extremely challenging one, and because Rachel's remains were discovered after more than a decade, it was impossible to identify the cause of death or the motive behind it. A murder charge would have required that the intent be proven. As a result of Keith's whole acceptance that he was responsible for Rachel's death, alongside other evidential factors, the case was again reviewed and a decision taken that a plea to manslaughter was acceptable, the spokesperson said. He added, "A guilty plea to manslaughter means that Keith Hall has been convicted of killing Rachel and disposing of her body, and our decision was carefully taken following consultation with both the police and Rachel's family." On November 1st, 2021, Keith was sentenced to 18.5 years in jail for manslaughter, living off the proceeds of prostitution, and perverting the course of justice. This was a relief to Rachel's family, who had waited for 19 long years to get justice for her. It's difficult to feel any sense of happiness with this result, when at the heart of this inquiry is a 19-year-old vulnerable girl who lost her life in extremely tragic circumstances, Detective Duell had later said after the sentencing. With Keith in jail, Rachel's family were able to take the first step towards moving forward. However, Nicola revealed that the road ahead would still be very difficult for the family. She stated, "It will be some kind of closure, but I don't think it will ever be complete closure for us because our nightmare is ongoing." She added, "I'd like Rachel to be remembered as the funny, cheeky girl that she always was. That part of her life was such a short period. There was so much more." Nancy Marie Bennallack. Nancy Marie Bennallack was born in Nevada, California on June 13, 1942. After spending her childhood in Nevada, she moved to Sacramento and worked as a court reporter. In 1970, 28-year-old Nancy was living alone with her cat on the second story of an apartment complex on Bell Street in Sacramento While working in Sacramento County Court, Nancy met and fell in love with Ferris Salome. Salome was chief public defender in the Sacramento District Court. They were engaged to be married, with the wedding scheduled for November 28, 1970. Just a month before the wedding, the couple spent their evening having fun before heading back to Nancy's apartment. Nancy quickly fell asleep, so Salome decided to go back to his home. At around 11:30 p.m., Salome left the apartment. Before leaving, he left the sliding glass door ajar so that Nancy's cat could come and go as it pleased in the night, which Nancy often did herself. He never imagined this simple act would put his fiancée in horrible danger. The next morning, on October 26, 1970, when Nancy did not show up for work, her coworkers grew concerned, as she never missed work. One of her coworkers sent her son to check up on Nancy. When no one opened the door, even after repeated knocks, he reached out to the building manager. Together, the building manager and the coworker's son discovered a heinous crime scene after entering the apartment with a passkey. Nancy was lying dead in a pool of her own blood in her bed. She had been ruthlessly stabbed over 30 times. Defensive wounds on her arms indicated that she tried desperately to fight off the attacker. The assault was so savage that her head was nearly decapitated. Authorities were alerted, and they arrived a few minutes later. Blood was everywhere, but no fingerprints were found inside the apartment, indicating that the murderer had probably concealed their fingers to avoid leaving fingerprints. A long blood trail was also discovered, which started from the second-story balcony, continuing to the sidewalk below and around the apartment complex buildings, which ended in the apartment complex parking lot. Investigators at that time believed that the attacker got into the apartment by climbing up to the balcony and then attacked and killed her. They surmised that the perpetrator must have gained access to the apartment by climbing up to the balcony and came in through the sliding glass door. They also theorized that this person had gotten injured during the attack, after which they climbed down. Based on the blood trail, the culprit would then have gotten into a vehicle in the complex parking lot and left. Nearly 500 people from the nearby area were questioned, but detectives had no suspects in their sights. Despite the efforts from law enforcement, the case grew cold. Although blood evidence was present there at the crime scene, it was not enough to apprehend the culprit. In the 70s, science was limited to the modern technology of 50 years ago, and only a blood type could be determined from someone's blood, and that's about it. In 2004, a DNA profile was developed from the blood collected from the crime scene and was uploaded to the state and national CODIS databases, but no match was found. Then, after nearly 50 years, in November 2019, detectives from the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office re-examined the cold case using forensic genetic genealogy, the same technology that was employed to identify the notorious Golden State Killer. The DNA profile was uploaded to a genealogy website to find possible suspects. Finally, on July 21, 2022, the murderer of Nancy Marie Bennallack was identified as Richard John Davis. Richard John Davis was born on the 22nd of March, 1943. In 1970, 27-year-old Richard Davis lived in the same apartment complex as Nancy. While Nancy lived in apartment number 17, Davis lived in number 23. They were on opposite ends of a pool, and Nancy's apartment could be seen across the pool from Davis's apartment. Among the 500 people, both Davis and his roommate were interviewed by the sheriff's office during the initial investigation. However, each provided alibis for one another. Davis had no previous convictions except for a driving under the influence charge, so his DNA had never been uploaded to the CODIS database. No motive for the murder has been mentioned, but the murder did appear to be premeditated, according to investigators, due to the killer's choice of placing masking tape over his fingertips, which clearly indicated this was a premeditated attack. Nancy was not close to Davis. The only connection they could find between Davis and Nancy was the apartment complex they both lived in. However, investigators now believe that Davis stalked Nancy and was jealous about her getting married to a decent man weeks later. Apparently, this jealousy and rage are what motivated him to break into her apartment and kill her. The revelation was bittersweet to Nancy's family, as Davis died on November 2, 1997, at 54 years of age, due to complications from alcoholism. However, they were relieved to finally know who was responsible for Nancy's death. Stephanie Hebert. On June 30th, 1972, Donald and Joyce Hebert were blessed with a beautiful baby girl. They named their daughter Stephanie Lynn Hebert. The middle-class family lived in a suburban neighborhood along the Mississippi River in Wagaman, Louisiana. In May of 1978, Stephanie graduated from kindergarten at Live Oak Manor Elementary School. Shortly after that, schools were dismissed for summer break. Kids were riding bikes back and forth from their homes to friends' homes, to convenience stores to buy treats, to explore wherever their little feet could pedal to, so long as they were back home when the streetlights came on, as was a common rule in those innocent times. Days before her 6th birthday, on June 13, 1978, Stephanie checked into her house to grab lunch. She had spent the previous night at her friend Lizzie's home. Around 2:30 p.m., after having a bite to eat, she again left her home to go to the house of another friend, Laurie, who lived just a few doors away. As it was a safe community, she went alone. This was the last time anybody saw Stephanie. She never made it to her friend's house. Authorities were notified, and they immediately started searching for the little girl with blonde hair, blue eyes, and baby blue-rimmed glasses. More than 100 deputies and 50 volunteers relentlessly searched for Stephanie on foot through the dense woods and swampy areas surrounding the subdivision. Helicopters were also flown over those woods to scan the whole area. They even called for heavy equipment to help give searchers access to areas covered in underbrush and vegetation. Her mother, Joyce, was quoted as saying during the search, "This is hell. I wouldn't wish this on anyone. Not even the devil." Initially, it was believed that Stephanie simply walked away and got lost on her own. But when she was not found after 72 hours of extensive searching, it was concluded that there had been a kidnapping. A single lead developed during the search. A local ice cream truck vendor said between 4:30 and 5 p.m. on the same day Stephanie disappeared, he sold 2 sticks of cotton candy to a girl that looked like her, accompanied by a woman wearing heavy makeup. Around 5:30 p.m., an 8-year-old neighbor boy had also seen Stephanie with a woman of similar description about 4 blocks from the Hebert home. However, no such woman could be found even after a thorough search, and the lead fizzled out. As the days passed into months, the chances of getting her back alive were slim. All efforts fell short. Sadly, 5 months later, on the week before Thanksgiving, a hunter made an awful discovery. About 20 miles away from her home, in a remote wooded area of St. Charles Parish, a tiny skeleton was found tied to a willow tree with a rope. Her glasses, shoes, and clothing were scattered nearby, except for her underwear. The remains were identified as 5-year-old Stephanie Hebert. Although an exact cause of death could not be determined, investigators believed she was still alive when she was left there to be eaten by creatures and consumed by the elements. As little Stephanie was laid to rest, investigators could not fathom what kind of monster could be capable of committing this horrendous crime. There were several suspects throughout the years, but none could be prosecuted due to the lack of solid evidence. The case soon turned cold. In 2012, a courageous victim came forward with some truly shocking information about her own sexual assault back in 1979. After the revelation, Daniel Parks emerged as a new suspect in Stephanie's murder. Daniel Parks lived only 8 houses down from where Stephanie lived when she was murdered. He raped a then 7-year-old local girl around the same time as Stephanie's disappearance. This was the same girl who came forward with the information in 2012. The girl was friends with Stephanie and remembered Parks threatening her, saying that she might end up like Stephanie. In the police interrogation, Parks confessed to the rape as well as the comment about Stephanie, but later recanted his confession. He maintained that he had incorrectly implicated himself in the crime due to his condition of diabetes. He was found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated rape and was sentenced to life in prison. He remained the suspect of Stephanie's murder for many years, but was never charged with her murder. Authorities set their sights on another suspect after Jason Franklin Jr., 50, referred to as Jay, came forward in 2012 to reveal the sexual and physical abuse he suffered at his own father's hands. His father, Jason Franklin Sr., was a resident of the same community as Stephanie in 1978. Jay went on to divulge an even more disturbing story from his childhood. He claimed that both of his parents were involved in Stephanie's abduction, and that he, at 6 years old, was not only a witness, but was used as bait to lure the young girl in. Jay told the investigators that his father, Jason Franklin Sr., was a serial predator of young children, and sometimes he was forced to watch and even take part in the abuse. According to Jay, Stephanie was one of those victims. Jay claimed that Jason raped Stephanie on 3 separate occasions before her murder. Jay also revealed that it was Joyce Vinay, his mother, who abducted Stephanie Hebert and brought her to her ex-husband, Jason Franklin Sr. Though the two were divorced, Vinay still loved Jason Franklin Sr. and would often help in his husband's sick activities. On June 13, 1978, Vinay lured Stephanie into their car and drove her to a house in Luling, where Jason was waiting. At some point, Jason put Stephanie into a car and told his former wife to follow. They drove to the swampy area where Stephanie's body would later be found. Jason stripped Stephanie of her clothes and took Polaroid photos while forcing Jay to pose with her. On previous occasions, Stephanie had kept her mouth shut about the abuse, but Vinay argued with Jason about whether this might be a step too far. Stephanie threatened to tell her father this time. Jay recalled her tearful declaration, "I am telling Daddy," a comment that perhaps sealed her fate. Jason witnessed his father straddling Stephanie, tying her to the tree, as they pulled away. He even led investigators to the exact area where Stephanie had been found. When detectives confronted Vinay, she denied involvement and called her son a liar. Despite Jay Franklin's testimony, it still took authorities years to prepare a case due to a lack of physical evidence. They had to determine whether the testimony was admissible and what charges Jason would be eligible for. In 2018, Jason Franklin Sr., 76, was finally arrested and charged with Stephanie's murder. Unfortunately, Joyce has never been charged due to a lack of evidence. Donald and Joyce Hebert lived long enough to see Jason Franklin Sr. arrested. Although they both died in 2020, hopefully they died in peace knowing their daughter's killer had been put away. However, the case was abruptly halted in January 2022 after Jason died of a respiratory illness while in prison. The investigation of this 44-year-old cold case was officially closed after Jay Franklin, the main witness, was killed by an alleged drunk driver in June 2022. For 42 years, Irene Wilkowitz waited to discover the identity of her sister Eve's killer. It was 4 decades of constant fear, not knowing if she too would be the victim of a murder. Eve Wilkowitz was a 20-year-old woman living in Bayshore, New York. She was working as a secretary at a publishing house. She was reported missing after failing to return home from a night out. Her body was found in a yard mere blocks from her apartment. She was kidnapped, raped, and strangled to death after taking a late-night train back from Manhattan. For Eve's sister Irene, the case haunted her for her entire life. She was just 17 years old when police arrived at their family home to deliver the devastating news. Irene never gave up the fight to find who killed her sister. She wasn't famous. She wasn't a celebrity. She was my sister, and she matters, said Irene. Eve was born on April 17, 1959. A Long Island native, Eve grew up in Oakdale, New York. After her mother's passing from cancer in 1977, she soon moved out of the family home and into her own apartment. Here she lived with her roommate, Robert Grogan, for 2 years. Friends described her as vibrant, with a heart as big as her dreams. She was working for a popular publishing house in Manhattan and frequently commuted by train. It took her 2 trips of 1 hour and 45 minutes each to get to work and return home daily. In 1980, though, Grogan remembered Eve mentioning a feeling of uneasiness. She told him about a couple of men that would follow her from the train station. One man had been pestering her to go out for a date, which she declined. A second followed her for the entire 10-minute walk back to their shared apartment. These pests eventually fell away, and Eve went on to meet a young writer named Jack Dempsey. On March 21, 1980, Jack and Eve spent the evening together in the city. They watched a movie and had dinner before going back to his apartment. Before falling asleep, she asked Jack to wake her up in time to catch the 12:45 a.m. train back to Long Island. The morning of March 22, 1980, Jack walked Eve to the train station. He'd offered to take the train with her, but she waved him off, telling him she'd be fine. He watched her board the Long Island Railroad train. He never saw Eve alive again. By 7 a.m. that morning, her roommate Robert noticed Eve did not return home. He hadn't initially reported anything until the evening, when no one could make contact with her. Together with family and friends, calls were made to local hospitals asking if they'd admitted anyone fitting Eve's description. There was no sighting of Eve anywhere, and panic began to settle in. A woman living just 3 blocks from Eve's apartment made a gruesome discovery in her neighbor's yard on the morning of March 25, 1980. Eve's lifeless body was found on the lawn of another neighbor. She was wearing blue jeans and a blouse. Her shoes and socks were missing. Police were called to the scene and soon discovered rope marks on her wrists, suggesting she'd been bound at some point. Police speculated she may have been held captive and sexually assaulted before being strangled to death and dumped just blocks from her apartment. When Eve's family were informed of her untimely passing, the trauma of her violent end would go on to haunt her sister Irene for the next 42 years. Investigations began, but leads were far and few. Suspects were interviewed and evidence collected, but nothing came from the case, and it went cold. Police even looked into Jack, the last person to see Eve alive. Jack was called out to Long Island. Police were keeping him as a person of interest in the case, seeing as they'd spent the last night together since she went missing. Jack understood the process and cooperated with officials. Fortunately for him, a medical student from whom he'd bought a stereo showed up to deliver the package along with his father. Both men were able to provide an alibi for Jack's whereabouts on Saturday morning. He also had to undergo a lie detector test to prove his innocence. In the 90s, though, 2 detectives showed up at his home and spoke to him before getting a DNA swab as part of evidence for future testing. All the while, the terror of being the next target remained with Irene. She worked as a nanny and shared an apartment with her son. This was in part due to her fear of living alone. For years, Irene became the advocate in finding Eve's killer. Being the only sibling, Irene had no one but her father to turn to when in doubt. Unfortunately, he too passed away in 2010 before knowing who was responsible. Irene kept the memory of Eve alive by giving interviews to local newspapers each year on the anniversary of Eve's murder. She went on to study, work, and marry. She raised 2 children and divorced before moving away from Long Island, living with the fear of being the target of a killer. Her pursuit for justice had her keeping up with detectives every few weeks, following up with leads and being active in the case. Although police were trying, DNA testing had not yet progressed to an advanced stage. Then, in 2018, Irene's son told her about the genetic genealogy testing used to identify the Golden State Killer. There was renewed hope. In January 2019, Irene contacted famous genealogist Cece Moore. However, Moore said that she could not get involved, as New York didn't yet allow the technique to be used in a criminal investigation. New York was one of the states hesitant to use the technology, as privacy advocates feared the government's misuse of people's personal data. It was going to be a rigorous process, one that would take months or years. The State Department of Health required a private lab to obtain a permit, which at the time was not being granted in the case. Irene pleaded with Suffolk County Police Lieutenant Kevin Bayer, who was a homicide investigator and oversaw Eve's case, to find a way. Bayer, too, was frustrated by the circumstances, but by December 2019, Suffolk County authorities found a loophole. Since the FBI helped with the original investigation, they were not restricted to New York laws. The semen sample lifted from Eve's body was sent to their labs with permission from the New York Department of Health. Agreeing to this, the FBI began the process of testing, and in July 2021, one of the agents specializing in genetic genealogy told investigators she'd found a distant relative of the unknown suspect, the common surname being Rice. Working with the information they had and several background checks, they found a direct name, Hebert Rice. Hebert, though, had been long dead by the time. He succumbed to cancer in 1991. Looking back into the original investigation, Rice was not considered a suspect despite a sweeping investigation of the area. He did have a few records of arrests for nonviolent crimes, but none that required he submit a DNA sample. At the time of the murder, Hebert was living with his mother after his then-wife kicked him out of their home. His mother's residence was just 4 houses away from the crime scene. Records showed that Rice's mother was questioned following the murder, but she said she didn't notice anything unusual during the time. Suffolk County Police Detective Jerry Batari had a possible name, and now he needed DNA confirmation before he could break the news to Irene. Detectives tracked down family members of Rice and came upon one of his sons. Failing to obtain a covert sample, Batari just walked up to the son's door and knocked. Hesitant at first, Rice's son eventually allowed Batari and his team to take a DNA swab. Once detectives explained their purpose for the visit, he explained that he had not shared a close relationship with his father. Rice's son and ex-wife filled much of the missing details surrounding the mystery. Although he was not responsible for Eve's murder, Rice's son still wished he could apologize for the actions of his father to the Wilkowitz family. In August 2021, the DNA sample proved that Rice was the killer, as his son's DNA sample provided the missing familial link. Batari, accompanied by other detectives, knocked on the door of Irene Wilkowitz and gave her the news that she'd been long waiting to hear. Irene admitted to expecting the worst, that detectives would tell her that they had hit a dead end. Falling into the arms of her son Evan, whom she'd named in memory of Eve, the nightmare that long haunted her waking hours came to an end. For 42 years, this is all I wanted. I just wanted it to be over. My goal was to be a mom, and beyond that, I didn't allow myself to dream any other dream because I was afraid someone would come along and murder me, she said. They explained to Eve the process of finding Hebert Rice, and after the meeting, Irene said she was open to talking to Rice's son. He too told detectives he would consider the option. Irene thanked all investigators for their outstanding dedication to the case and in solving Eve's murder. I just want to say thank you, said Irene, and how sorry I feel for him and his family to know that a family member is responsible for a crime like this, and they have to live knowing that. It's horrible for them as well. Before announcing the case being solved, investigators obtained a search warrant to exhume Rice's body. The results of testing came back positive on March 23, 2022, nearly 42 days to the date of Eve's kidnapping. Suffolk County Police Commissioner Richard Harrison praised genetic genealogy for the ability to help them find the killer. Bayer praised Irene for her enduring faith in finding Eve's killer. He said she was the real star of the case. In the years that passed, Jack Dempsey wrote on a blog about the feelings that consumed him following Eve's brutal murder. He writes about the impact her death had on his emotions and the periods of heartache. He likens her loss to a cosmic iron wall that he needed to climb to find release. At the end, though, he thanked her for the inspiration she gave him and the guidance she still provides as he makes his way up into the world of writing. In his blog, Dempsey encapsulates the emotions felt by all those who had the privilege of knowing Eve and now feeling the void of her loss. For Irene, though, there will always be unanswered questions. I can't ask him anything. Why did he do it? There are no real answers, no reason why, she said. Irene wants her sister to be remembered not just as a story being retold to the media. She was a real person, and she'd like to be a big sister to me. I want people to know that, she said. Super Bowl Sunday, 1989. While America celebrated the San Francisco 49ers winning over the Cincinnati Bengals, the Rogers family suffered in silence without any word from their beloved sister and daughter, Cynthia. Cynthia Rogers was a 27-year-old biologist working on Parkinson's disease research at the National Institute of Health. She was living alone in an apartment complex in the Forestville area of Prince George County. Her family last heard from her on the morning of January 22, 1989. According to her family, she planned on doing some grocery shopping. She'd been on her way to the local store, along the familiar tree-lined path used by locals. Unknown to Cynthia, evil lurked among the trees, waiting for an opportunity to strike. For 5 days, Cynthia's continued silence fueled her family to begin a search for her that would end in tragedy. Her body was discovered on January 27, 1989, dumped alongside a dirt path strewn with litter in a wooded area of Forestville. Detective Bernie Nelson described the attack as extremely vicious. Cynthia suffered multiple blunt force injuries to her head and upper body. She was sexually assaulted and eventually strangled to death. Described as a free spirit and someone who loved watching birds and taking long walks, Cynthia's death left a void in the lives of her loved ones. For her mother, Rosia Rogers, there was no healing. "It's just a big hole, you know," she told Fox 5 during an interview in 2001.
It's just a big old hole, you know.
By then, it had already been 12 years since Cynthia's murder, and investigations had hit a stumbling block. Although DNA evidence collected at the scene was used to rule out possible suspects, the sample was still not strong enough to enter into the FBI database. The profile that the FBI was able to develop from the sample wasn't strong enough to meet the standards entered into the database. But it is something we can work with, given the name of someone we can approach and obtain their DNA and compare it directly to the sample, said Nelson. But there was no name. No suspects ever appeared on the radar in connection to Cynthia's murder. However, on January 24, 2022, the case was revived by investigators. Not without the help of Cynthia's cousin, Dawn. She'd been working tirelessly to find new methods of technology that could help detectives solve the case that had haunted their family for far too long. She spent years probing detectives and inquiring about DNA advancements until she finally had her voice heard. "I've been making any efforts I could to keep this case in the forefront. It's a glimmer of hope in general that my efforts were not in vain," said Dawn. New technology meant DNA could be retested using newer methods of analysis. Investigators found their suspect, James Clinton Cole, a 64-year-old convict already serving a life sentence. Cole's records painted a picture of a dark criminal past. He was charged with a misdemeanor assault in 1984, a destruction of property charge just days before Cynthia's murder, and a charge of child abuse in 1995. In 2009, the long arm of the law finally caught up to Cole when his DNA matched to a rape investigation back in 1996. The girl had been walking behind Benjamin Stoddard Middle School when she was accosted by the suspect at knife point. He then forced her into the wooded area where he proceeded to rape her. Before fleeing, he tied her hands and feet with scraps of material. She was able to free herself and sought help at a nearby residence. Police questioned the girl, who described her attacker as a medium-complexion black man. He had short hair, was 6 feet tall, and was wearing a black and white striped shirt. The similarities between the crime scenes provided police with an understanding of how Cole planned his attacks. He was an opportunistic criminal. He was arrested and charged for the rape of the 12-year-old girl that occurred on the 20th of August, 1996. He received 2 life sentences, and during his imprisonment, was linked to the murder of Cynthia through advanced DNA testing. He's currently serving a sentence at the Western Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland. Cole was charged with first-degree murder, first-degree rape, and several other offenses against Cynthia. It's unclear when he'll appear in court, but Cynthia's family want to be there when it does happen. For her mother, Rosia, the news has made things lighter. "It makes us feel better. "In my heart, I feel lighter," she said. But she wants her moment with her daughter's killer. "I really want to see this person who did this face to face," says Rosia. For Cynthia's brother, Philip Rogers, the burden has been lifted to a certain point. There will never be a full recovery because of the incident, but we have had some relief, he stated. Investigators do not believe Cynthia and Cole knew each other. They've concluded that Cole may have seen a young, petite woman who proved to be an easy target for his sinister intentions. For 3 decades, the mystery of Nona Stamey Cobb's murder eluded investigators. Nona's body was found along I-77 on the northbound side in Surrey County on July 7, 1992, in the early morning. A female witness who remained anonymous last saw her getting into a truck on the night of July 6, 1992, at the Welcome Center on Interstate 55 in Cleveland County. The truck was being driven by an unidentified white male. Nona was a 29-year-old widow with a 3-year-old son named Josh. She spiraled into drug addiction and 7 months before her murder had lost custody of Josh. Her sister, Vicki S. Gregory, was raising the boy together with her husband. Vicki, though, maintained that Nona was a loving mother who loved her son and family deeply. "She loved us and we loved her. Just because you do something wrong doesn't mean you stop loving her," she said. Nona was found strangled to death by a passing driver on the highway with very little evidence apart from DNA on her clothing and semen on her body. There were no suspects police could pinpoint at the time. Then, in April 1995, 3 years after Nona's murder, interest was revived following the confession of a known serial killer. Sean Patrick Goebel came forward and confessed to the murders of 3 women. Goebel allegedly targeted sex workers and transported them across states before dumping their bodies along interstates. He confessed to the murders of Brenda K. Hagee, aged 45, Sherry Tu Mansour, aged 34, and Rebecca Haynes, aged 36. His modus operandi seemed to match that of Nona's murder. However, DNA testing cleared Goebel as a suspect in Nona's murder after the semen sample did not match with Goebel's DNA profile. Investigators were back to square one. It wasn't until April 2021 that new technology would help solve the decades-old mystery. The North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, Surrey County Sheriff's Office, and Identifinders International collaborated to catch a killer. Using the latest method in DNA testing and genetic genealogy, investigators, together with Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, president and founders of Identifinders International, identified 71-year-old Warren Luthen Alexander. By using DNA submitted from family members, investigators were able to narrow down the suspect list and identify Alexander through the DNA evidence collected at the crime scene. Alexander was arrested at his home in Diamond Head, Mississippi on March 15, 2022, and held at the Hancock County Jail. He was extradited back to North Carolina on March 27, 2022, and has been jailed without bond. He was charged with the murder and the death of Nona Stamey Cobb. The investigation is ongoing, as many other homicides along the interstate remain unsolved. Police have not directly linked Alexander to other cases as of yet. Sheriff Steve Hyatt gave due credit to the investigators who worked on the case since 1992, stating that the groundwork done by the original investigative team allowed them to find Nona's killer 30 years later through proper evidence preservation. SBI Director Robert Schirmeyer had some strong words for criminals. "I want to send a clear message here. Hear my words. The men and women of the SBI, in partnerships with sheriff's offices across the state and around the country, will seek out justice for the cold cases that we have in our books. We will work day and night to pursue the suspects who think they may have gotten away with it 20, 30, 40 years ago," he said. "I will tell you, genetic genealogy is a game changer," said Schirmeyer. When investigators solved Diane Dahn's murder 34 years later, her son Mark Bayer, now 36 years old, was blown away by how the killing was solved. The only evidence ever recorded were fingernail scrapings and a hair from Diane's hands. Diane Lynn Dahn was a 29-year-old mother of one. She was the first female radio repair technician at the San Diego Transit Company. Friends described her as a free spirit with a wicked sense of humor. She loved to draw and was a talented violinist. Diane also had a love for stock car racing and was often down at the El Cajon Speedway watching races. When Diane failed to show up for work on May 2, 1998, co-workers found this behavior out of character. Concern prompted one of them to drop by her Santee apartment to check up on her. What she found was horrifying. Diane's nude body lay in her bed. She'd been stabbed multiple times and bludgeoned to death. Her then 2-year-old son Mark was wandering around the apartment complex unsupervised. Police were called and investigations began, but the leads dried up quickly. Digging into Diane's past, there seemed to be no enemies, no vindictive exes or spouses, no spurned lovers, no motive for life insurance claims. It was not a case of sexual assault or robbery. The killer was a phantom. Despite questioning the maintenance man, there were no new leads and the case grew cold. Mark was adopted and raised by Diane's close friends, but often visited with her family in order to keep the memory of his mother alive. In an interview, Mark Byer said that although he did have his family, there is a sense of loneliness knowing you've lost your mother. Looking back at some of the struggles that you go through, you kind of feel alone because of what you went through, he said. In the years 2000 and 2001, with technology progressing, investigators tried once more to test the DNA found at the crime scene. Putting it through a federal DNA database from unsolved crimes yielded no results. The sample was not strong enough. In 2010, a cold case team took another crack at the case. This time, they scoured the evidence looking for clues that may have been overlooked. The hair found in Diane's hands was matched to the DNA scrapings taken from underneath her nails. It was a match, proving Diane fought back. The sample was put through CODES this time. However, no matches were made. This meant Diane's killer didn't commit other serious crimes, or was smooth enough not to be caught. Then in 2020, the cold case team joined forces with the crime lab and utilized the new technology known as genetic genealogy. By tracing genetic profiles of family members to DNA found at unsolved crime scenes, suspects who would have gotten away with crimes were able to be traced. The Sheriff's Department released a statement with regard to the methods they used to track Diane's killer. They said that it was important to note that genetic genealogy was a last resort in solving homicide cases. Over the years, all avenues had been exhausted. It was most likely the case would have gone unsolved had it not been for the new technology. Using the single strand of hair and samples of DNA scrapings, investigators were able to match the DNA to possible relatives on the genealogy database. It was an exhaustive task, but pure determination brought with it results. Investigators and genealogists pored over 1,300 DNA samples of possible relatives and created 9 family trees before a single common name popped up: Warren Robertson. Robertson was never on the radar as a suspect in the case. He was a local tow truck driver who also lived in the same apartment complex as Diane. He too was known to enjoy stock car racing and did visit the El Cajon Speedway on occasion. However, investigators found no link between the two and could not determine if they'd known each other. Robertson was born in Arkansas but spent the major part of his life in San Diego. After the murder, he moved to Lakeside, leaving his family behind. He eventually moved to Indiana in 1989. Robert, it seemed, had no criminal past, his most serious offense being the murder of Diane. Unfortunately for the family of Diane, justice was not to be served. Robertson died 21 years prior to the discovery of Diane's murderer. He was killed during a house fire in Indiana in November 1999, aged 39. For Diane's family, getting the answer to the who brought with it a sense of relief. Byer remains satisfied with the outcome, even though the killer will not see justice served. The answers that my family received is closure, and closure is everything, even after so much time has passed, he said. Byer went on to say that he heard many good things about his mother from friends and family. She was a good person. Everything I've ever been told and heard about her is that she was a good person, and I like to think that those values have transferred off to me, and I do my best to be a good person. The world could always use more good people, he said. Diane's younger sister, Victoria Dan Minter, said she was grateful to investigators who helped solve the case. I don't think anything was ever going to come of this. I thought I myself was going to go to my grave not knowing, as well as my mother and father, she said. When they came back and said they got a hit, it probably was, other than the birth of my children, the best day of my life. She can now rest in peace. At least there's an answer, but it doesn't make the pain any better, said Victoria. The sheriff's office said in a statement, this murder would likely have gone unsolved if not for the use of investigative genetic genealogy. In January 1999, police responded to calls from a neighbor reporting screaming from a residence in the 1300 block of Carlson Boulevard. The screaming reportedly lasted over 30 seconds before all went silent. At first he tried to go around and check on this neighbor himself, but thought twice and called 911 instead. When police arrived, they found the front door locked. The back door, though, was left ajar. Inside, officers discovered the body of Meekiah Wadley on her bedroom floor. She was dead, but her body was still warm to the touch. Her hands were bound with shoelaces, and she'd been raped before being smothered to death. A buck knife was found underneath her body. At just 28 years old, Meekiah's young life was snatched away brutally. She left behind an 18-month-old daughter and scores of family members who remember her fondly and never stopped chasing the truth. Her sister, Keelia Wadley, described her as an outgoing person, always smiling and making friends. She had the same group of friends since elementary school, the same group of friends now. Just a sweet person, she said. Meekiah's niece, Devine Peterson, said her aunt was someone people always loved having around and hanging around. My favorite auntie. She was beautiful, outgoing, and smart. She loved hanging out and having fun, she said. Police began an intensive investigation. Initially, investigators focused on a man she'd spent time with the previous evening. Other than him, there were no other leads. He, however, was ultimately ruled out as a suspect. The case grew cold as the only person of interest was ruled out. For the next 20 years, though, police continued to follow up on the case by testing the DNA found under Meekiah's fingernails and a bloodstain found in the bedroom. In 2002, a mixed DNA profile was created from the swabs collected from Meekiah's hands and the bloodstain. The profile was submitted to the Department of Justice to search their offender database. This yielded no results. 18 years later, in 2020, additional DNA testing was done, this time focusing on previously untested fingernail clippings and ligatures. This provided authorities with a male DNA profile. In October of the same year, the DNA profile created by the Contra Costa County Crime Lab was submitted to the DOJ's DNA Databank program. This was done to conduct a familial search of the state's DNA index system. In April 2021, the DOJ's investigation revealed a person who was potentially a first-degree relative of the suspected perpetrator. The relative, though, was ruled out as a suspect. Police, however, had a suspect name, but were keeping the revelation quiet until they could find a confirmed sample. It was going to be difficult because the suspect was already dead. Detectives were able to track down an immediate relative of the suspect in September 2021. A buccal swab was obtained and submitted to the crime lab for testing. That same month, investigators received the confirmation they needed. Meekiah's killer was identified as 35-year-old Jerry Lee Henderson. Henderson was someone who was known to Meekiah. They shared a mutual friend and often stayed over at the same friend's house. But Henderson had overstayed his welcome. When the mutual friend refused to house Henderson any longer, he instead went to bunk at Meekiah's home, not expecting her to return home. Police believe this is when he attacked Meekiah and fled the scene after the crime. Whispers abounded and rumors spread with regard to the nature of the crime. Meekiah's sister Keelia cleared up the confusion surrounding the murder of her sister. Many people labeled the murder as a domestic violence dispute. She refuted the claims, stating that Henderson and her sister were just friends who went to the same college. There had never been a romantic relationship between the two.
So he was a friend of her friend Terry, and they both knew him.
At a press conference on April 21, 2022, police revealed that the suspect was identified but had died 11 days after murdering Meekiah from an apparent drug overdose. Acting Richmond Police Chief Louis Tirona withheld the name.
So we're 100% confident that he is the murderer. I don't want to give him any honor by mentioning who that might be.
Who wore shirts printed with her photo to show their undying support, to stand up and be heard. Meekiah's niece, Devonay, raised her hand to get Tarina's attention. Why is it okay that he's a secret? We know what he did. Why can't the family know? They look at him as a hero. He's not a hero. He's a murderer, she said.
We know what he did. Why the family can't know? They look at him as a hero. He's not a hero. He's a murderer.
Tarina responded by asking her, why give someone fame and notoriety for a murder?
Why give somebody fame and notoriety for committing such a murder?
Attendees at the press conference supported the family's request, demanding that authorities give them the closure they deserved. Bowing to pressure from the crowd, Tarina finally named Henderson as the suspect in Meekiah's murder. After the press conference, Meekiah's sister, Meekiah Wadley, spoke to Oxygen.com to iron out a few details. She said the press conference didn't do the story justice, and it felt hurtful and humiliating. She told the news outlet that Meekiah actually made it to the hospital, that she herself saw the staff working on her. The identification of Henderson, though, had brought some sense of closure to the family, and their justice was served. Keela stated that Meekiah fought back, and that was what ultimately helped investigators find and recover the DNA needed to find Henderson. Meekiah would have turned 50 this year and been a proud grandmother. Her daughter is now a mother herself, said Keela. When given the opportunity to speak at the press conference, Keela simply said that the time of seeking answers for deaths of family members needed to stop. Those communities needed to end the senseless violence. In a statement released by California Attorney General Rob Bonta, he said that it was his sincere hope that this resolution brings the family of Meekiah Wadley a measure of peace. Bonta reiterated that no stone will remain unturned to secure justice and find the truth. Nothing can ever bring back a loved one, but we're committed to doing all that we can to help bring the truth to light in the fight for justice, he said. Get to the hospital. These were the words uttered in a phone call made by the younger brother of Kevin Drinks. The family rushed to the hospital assuming Kevin was involved in an accident, only to discover he'd been killed in a shooting. Those 4 words continued to haunt Kenya Drinks for 10 years until the men responsible for killing her husband Kevin were finally brought to justice. Kevin, who was 50 years old, was gunned down on December 10, 2011. He was parked behind Underground Market Furniture in North Philadelphia. He had just started work 4 days prior as a delivery driver. He was shot 3 times just after 6:30 p.m. and was rushed to hospital where he died shortly after arriving. For the family, it was a puzzling situation. Anyone who knew Kevin knew he was a doting grandfather who regularly went to church and sang gospel songs. To him, family was everything. For Kenya, though, she had lost the love of her life. Kevin and Kenya met back in 1978, high school sweethearts who attended their Germanstown High School prom together. However, they broke up after graduation. 2 decades later, they reconnected after Kenya's mother passed away in the year 2000. Kevin stopped by to pay his respects. The rest was history. Kevin was a divorcee, but that didn't stop Kenya from making the best of this second chance. The two married in 2001, with Kevin serenading Kenya as she walked down the aisle. 10 years later, in 2011, they bought their dream home together in Ronhurst. For the next few months, they would spend time in their home, filling it with a shared love for each other. Kevin loved his family and enjoyed spending time with his 3 daughters and 5 grandchildren. Those were the last few months Kenya would share with her beloved husband. No one could foresee the call from Kevin's younger brother that was the end to the fairy tale she was building with Kevin. The only question on everyone's mind was, who would want to kill Kevin? Nothing panned out from the investigations made by police. People began to whisper that maybe there was something more to the killing. The home she built with Kevin became a shell of its former glory. But Kenya and Kevin's family didn't back down. She persisted with keeping up the investigation with police. T-shirts and buttons featuring Kevin's face were printed and distributed. Flyers were constantly circulated to ensure the memory of his case remained alive. The Justice for Kevin Drinks movement began. Kenya called upon elected officials to take action and shut down the whispers of Kevin being involved in underhand dealings. Frustration grew as other cases were being solved, but the Drinks family persisted in their unwavering belief that justice would be served. A month after Kevin's murder, Kenya called upon State Representative W. Curtis Thomas. There was a vigil and news conference organized by Thomas. We all must begin to take ownership and responsibility in our communities and stand up against the lawless element that's committed the crime. What happened to Kevin Drinks could happen to any of us, said Thomas. Thomas went on to implore community members to join in community policing. He said that everyone needed to come together in order to stop this senseless violence. Thomas called for the formation of a police substation along the busy corridor and an increase in bike patrols and beat cops. Captain Branville G. Bard agreed with Thomas and added to the sentiment felt by many present at the vigil. This is our community, and we live here. We're imploring people to speak up, he said. He mentioned that every day that passes and Kevin's murderer goes without being caught showed that people just didn't care. The vigil fed a fire in Kenya until time started to get the best of her and her faith in justice. Kenya prayed. She eventually moved away from the painful memories and also out of fear for her safety. Over time, though, her faith began to dwindle. Kenya understood the police were overwhelmed, but sometimes wondered if Kevin's case was even being worked on. But frustration grew. Kenya feared the case was going to grow ice cold. Slowly, she stopped calling the police as frequently as she used to. Kenya said her calls were often met with a patronizing attitude. She grew disappointed, questioning what was so hard in finding Kevin's killer. Her faith was further knocked when police were able to solve the killing of a fellow officer who was killed after Kevin. Killing an officer is the highest level of disrespect. I understand that. But if the department were willing to pull every stop to find someone who shot one of their own, why couldn't they do that for Kevin? She asked. Kenya became vocal about the lack of action in Kevin's case. I want justice for every murder victim in the city. If you take an oath to protect us, you should treat us the same as you would an officer, she said. She waited, biding her time as the case grew colder. Years passed with no new leads or feedback. And then there was a break in the case. In 2018, she got the call she'd been waiting for. It was a bittersweet moment when Kenya and her family discovered that Kevin was killed in a case of mistaken identity. Philadelphia police detective John Verrecchio had been listening in on recordings of jailhouse conversations. They were investigating a different case through the coded conversations between prisoners when he stumbled across a conversation related to Kevin's case. 2 months before Kevin was killed, Chad Reynolds had been accused of murdering a 22-year-old man named Kristen Freeman. Reynolds was worried about a witness that was going to testify against him, so he plotted with 3 other men, Michael Blackston, Samaj Armstead, and Rashawn Combs. The men were discussing the description of the witness, his workplace, and the kind of car he drove. They were formulating a plot to kill him and went through with it in December 2011. The witness they wanted to silence bore a striking resemblance to Kevin Drinks. They had killed the wrong man. The jailhouse conversation led to the convictions of the 4 men. In March 2022, all 4 men were found guilty of murder, conspiracy, and related charges in the death of Kevin Drinks. Reynolds, Blackston, and Armstead were found guilty in the first degree and sentenced to life imprisonment. Combs was given the lesser charge of third-degree murder. His sentencing was due to be heard on June 29th. It was later revealed that Michael Blackston was accused of killing 5 other people, with police saying the number qualified him as a serial killer. Following the sentencing, Kenya praised the work done by Assistant District Attorney Ashley Toxalowski and Christian Wynn. She also thanked Witness Victim Coordinator Kathy Lees and called them her dream team. District Attorney Larry Krasner held a press conference in April 2022 near the place where Kevin was gunned down. Krasner told everyone present that Drinks was under surveillance for an entire day before he was killed in a case of mistaken identity. He then invited Kenya to speak. Though nervous at first, she took the stand and looked at the button that read, "Justice for Kevin Drinks," the one she and her family and friends had worn for a decade. Then she spoke. "Family, take the buttons off. Justice is done. Justice is served. We don't need those buttons anymore." For Kenya, her eyes have been opened to the number of families who, like her, still wait for answers surrounding the unsolved murders of their loved ones. One such person was a woman who stood by Kenya through the trial, Kathy Lees. Kathy confided to Kenya that her own son, Justin Reyes, was gunned down just 6 months prior to Kevin's murder. The case remains unsolved, but by seeing Kenya's persistence and ultimate victory in getting the answers she needed, Kathy has hope that she too would one day find the answers to her own son's murder. For 3 decades, the death of 22-year-old Susan Amy Morse baffled investigators. However, investigators now believe that they may have found the man responsible for the murder of Susan and a separate sexual assault that occurred in the same apartment complex a year later. When Susan failed to show up for work on August 16, 1989, her parents grew concerned. They requested police do a welfare check as Susan's absence was uncharacteristic behavior. Susan lived alone in the Mesa apartment. Police entered the apartment, which was eerily quiet, and made a gruesome discovery. Susan had been beaten and asphyxiated with an extension cord, the covers of her bed pulled up around her body. Police later discovered she had also been sexually assaulted. There were no leads, despite police canvassing the area and asking neighbors questions. No information surfaced, and the case was pushed to the back burner. A year later, in November 1990, another incident occurred at the same apartment complex. A 23-year-old woman called police to report a break-in. She told police that she awoke to a man holding a knife to her stomach. He told her that he was not going to hurt her, just rape her. The man reportedly crawled in through an open window. He sexually assaulted the woman, but left her alive. Her attacker then stole cash and a VCR before escaping. Following the second attack in the apartment complex, investigators looked back at evidence from both crime scenes and determined that the crimes were connected. There was no suspect in the case, though. For years, both cases sat cold at the Mesa Police Department. Susan's parents unfortunately passed away before they could get the answers they wanted. The technology of the time was not as advanced to determine the DNA profile of the suspect responsible for the murder and sexual assault cases. The break in the unsolved cases came in March 2022. Through genetic genealogy testing, DNA recovered from both crime scenes were used to develop a family tree for the suspect. The search was narrowed down until one name popped up, Thomas Cox. Mesa Police Department Sergeant Chuck Trapani said it was constant searching for newer advanced technology in testing DNA that helped with the solving of cases. In the case of Thomas Cox and Susan Morse, it worked out dramatically. Cox, who is 58 years old, was identified through familial markers. What cemented investigators' pursuit of him was the fact that Cox's mother lived next door to Susan at the time of her murder. In initial investigations, he'd never been considered a person of interest in either case. Police staked out Cox's Colorado Springs home and recovered a styrofoam cup, lid, and straw. The DNA lifted from the recovered items matched that of the DNA found at both crime scenes. Furthermore, a print lifted from a screen that had been removed from one of the victim's windows matched the prints of Cox. These were already in the system after he committed several misdemeanors in the 80s and 90s. Cox was linked to another attack of an unnamed victim around November 13, 1990. In March 2022, Cox was indicted following the 1989 killing of Susan and the sexual assault at the same apartment complex in November 1990. He was charged with a total of 16 counts in both cases that included first-degree murder, sexual assault, burglary, and kidnapping. On April 23, 2022, Cox was extradited from El Paso County to Maricopa County. He was held on a $1 million cash bond. The FBI in Phoenix, who also assisted with the case, released a statement that read, "The passage of time does not deter law enforcement's persistence for truth and justice. authorities were able to make contact with an aunt and cousin of Susan's who expressed their relief in having finally caught the man responsible for her death. On May 4, 2022, the Mesa Police Department released a statement from one of Cox's victims who wished to remain anonymous. In it, she said that she didn't believe this day would come. She was thankful for the work done by Detective Samuel and the Mesa Police Department. She also passed her deepest sympathies to the family of Susan Morse and said that, "I didn't know Susan, but my fight became her fight. My pain became her pain, and my tears were her tears." She ended by saying that she learned how to stop being a victim and start being a survivor, despite what Thomas Cox took from her that night. For the criminals in these cases, it may have taken decades before they were captured and made to answer for their crimes, but the law never stops. On August 25, 1995, a passerby discovered the remains of a woman in a sleeping bag along Pine Hill Road in Kitsap County. When police responded, they discovered the woman was naked and suffered 2 gunshot wounds to the head. She was later identified through her fingerprints as Patricia Lorraine Barnes, a 61-year-old native of Seattle. Barnes was a somewhat well-recognized figure. People called her the Towel Lady, as she was often seen wearing a towel or bandana wrapped around her head. She was homeless and bounced between homeless shelters in Seattle. She was also known to frequent the Pioneer Square area. Police ruled her death a homicide and collected over 130 items of evidence from the crime scene. In an attempt to find leads, police canvassed the area and witnesses came forward with information regarding Barnes's whereabouts prior to the discovery. Some alleged to have seen her with a white male aged 30 to 35 years old. The pair allegedly told another man they planned to eat at Courthouse Park before making their way to Federal Way. It was the first time they saw this man with her. No one saw Barnes again until her body was discovered dumped on the roadside. A composite sketch was drawn up, but no leads came from the picture after it was circulated. Police also believe Barnes may have been the victim of Robert Lee Yates, known as the Spokane serial killer, a murderer who had shot his victims before dumping their bodies in remote locations. Barnes did not exactly fit the profile of Yates's victims, but the similarities in the murder were striking. He was, however, ruled out when police discovered he was stationed in Alabama during the time of Barnes's murder. The case went cold. In 2018, a renewed interest developed in solving cold cases following the use of genetic genealogy to track killers who had previously gone undetected. Barnes's case was reopened in 2018 as part of a division-wide focus on past cold cases. Given the amount of physical evidence, investigators began looking through the pieces of the puzzle that was the Barnes murder. They re-interviewed past detectives and began exploring new DNA testing tools that had become available. This time around, Yates was excluded from the investigation, as a thorough review of his movements placed him out of town during the time of Barnes' murder. In August 2020, acting on earlier information, a search warrant for DNA was executed in Houston, Texas, with the assistance of the Harris County District Attorney's Office. Investigators followed up on a lead regarding a person of interest who was believed to be the last person to see Barnes alive. The DNA sample taken from the person did not match what was recovered from Barnes or the crime scene. Investigators pushed for further testing and discovered that a single unidentified male DNA profile was found on 3 separate evidence sources at the crime scene. The DNA was found on Barnes's body and matched that of a cigarette butt that was discarded near her body. After putting the profile into CODIS, there was still no match. Whoever had killed Barnes was not entered into the national database. With leads now exhausted despite the technology, KCSO partnered with Othram Labs. They were able to create a genealogical profile, and Othram Labs worked hard to narrow down to a specific person. There was a lead found in December 2021. Acting on the information, KCSO investigators followed the lead down to Nogales, Arizona. With assistance from the Arizona Police Department, they tracked down the identified suspect, Douglas Keith Crone. Crone was a career criminal. He had 5 felony convictions to his name, according to records in Washington. This included a conviction for first-degree robbery in 1984. He was also arrested in Pierce County in 1994 for kidnapping in the second degree. For some reason, though, his DNA was not entered into any criminal database. In an ironic twist of fate, Crone was already dead. He had allegedly been electrocuted while installing a television antenna that hit a nearby power line in September 2016. It was his death, however, that helped investigators in identifying his connection to the DNA. With help from the Arizona Police Department and Pima County Medical Examiner's Office, biological material taken from Crone's post-mortem was allowed to be used to match the DNA profile developed by investigators. In January 2022, Washington State Patrol Crime Lab concluded the biological material from Crone's post-mortem matched the DNA extracted from Barnes's crime scene and the discarded cigarette butt. Kitsap County Sheriff's Office Detective Mike Grant called the cigarette butt the linchpin that blew the case open. The evidence on the body could mean one of 2 or 3 different things, but when you have a cigarette butt with the DNA, and the DNA on her body, and on items around her body, it was conclusive to me that we had the right guy, he said. Detectives also realized the initial composite sketch bared a striking resemblance to Crone, who would have been around 33 years old at the time of the murder. Grant reached out to the family of Barnes, who were described as being shocked and grateful that they have answers now after nearly 30 years of uncertainty. Laurie Houts. Laurie Ann Houts was born in Las Vegas, Nevada on February 6, 1967. She was the third among 4 siblings. Growing up, Laurie cherished her friends and family as much as they cherished her. Attending Gunderson High School in San Jose, California, Laurie was a bright student who also participated in many sports. Her love for technology put her ahead of her time. Eventually, Laurie would go on to earn a well-established engineering position in one of the largest tech companies, Adobe Systems. Soon she moved to Silicon Valley and was living in an apartment on Charleston Road in Santa Clara County. She reportedly also had a loving relationship with her boyfriend, who has never been named. On September 5, 1992, Laurie left for work, but she never arrived there. On the same day, during his regular run, a jogger made a gruesome discovery on the 1300 block of Crittenden in Mountain View, now the site of Google's campus. A woman was found dead in the passenger seat of her car near a garbage dump. Authorities were notified about the discovery, and they identified the woman as 25-year-old Laurie Houts. A nylon rope was still around her neck, which suggested she had been strangled to death. The crime scene did not hold many clues for investigators. Latent footprints were found both inside and outside of her car. Laurie's footprints were found on the dashboard, indicating that a struggle had occurred. However, it was not a robbery. Her wallet was found nearby, undisturbed. Laurie was found just 2 miles away from her workplace. Initially, investigators focused on the boyfriend as an obvious suspect. Yet he was ruled out later when his fingerprints did not match the fingerprints found on Laurie's car. However, the prints matched another person who was close to him, his roommate, John Kevin Woodwards. John was someone who could absolutely have been the assailant. Not only were his fingerprints in Laurie's car, but he had a possible motive too. Allegedly, John was not a fan of Laurie. He was somewhat jealous of her as he had growing romantic feelings towards his roommate, her boyfriend. Besides that, Laurie's success in the tech world, a place that was dominated by males in the 90s, was something else that irked him greatly. When Laurie's boyfriend asked him if he killed Laurie, he did not give him a straight answer. Instead, he asked what information the investigators had. This behavior was both strange and suspicious. A month after the killing, John Woodwards was arrested for murder. At the 1995 trial, John's defense claimed that he had inadvertently left fingerprints on Laurie's car because it was parked in front of his house some days before the murder. Prosecutors could not place him inside the vehicle. The first trial resulted in a hung jury. A second trial was held in 1996, but also resulted in a hung jury and was declared a mistrial. A judge dismissed the charges, saying he could not be charged again without new evidence. After the second trial, John moved to the Netherlands. Despite the possible suspect and developments made in the case early on, this case went cold. However, the investigation remained open. 30 years later, detectives successfully connected John Woodward's, now 58 and a software firm CEO, to Laurie Houts' murder. With the help of new DNA technology, they were able to extract new evidence from the original crime scene and compare it with John's DNA. His DNA matched the DNA found on the rope tied around Laurie's neck. In July 2022, after police received a tip that John was heading back to the U.S., they caught him at JFK Airport after he landed. He was arrested in New York, where he's currently being held pending extradition to California. If found guilty, he's facing life in prison. The family stated after the arrest that this is not a win because they still don't get to have their sister back, but they're hopeful that they will finally get some justice for her. Susan Winters. Susan Arlene Winters was born on March 14, 1966, to Danny and Avis Winters in Oklahoma. Her parents and older brother Christopher adored her from the day she was born. In 1984, Susan was phenomenal in both studies and sports. She led her high school softball team to the state championship. She kept running and won her age bracket in marathons. She went on to study law after obtaining a graduate degree in political science from Oklahoma University. Her career flourished from the start. She worked for a year in the Clark County District Attorney's Office, toiled at a Las Vegas law firm, and sometimes filled in as a judge in North Las Vegas Justice Court. While Susan succeeded well in her career, it was time for her to start a family. She married Brent Dennis in August 1995, a psychologist by profession. Their first daughter, Avis L., was born 4 years later in October 1999. The family welcomed a second daughter, Anna Danielle, in April 2002. Susan was passionate about every aspect of her life. She was an avid reader, a marathon runner, an animal lover, and a devoted mother and wife. Despite being a hardworking attorney at her workplace, she dedicated all her free time to her family. It would all change on January 3, 2015. At 6:48 a.m. that day, Susan's husband, Brent Dennis, called 911 after finding his 48-year-old wife unresponsive in bed. Paramedics quickly arrived to find Susan holding on to life, and she was taken to the hospital. Unfortunately, at 2:26 p.m., Susan passed away after Dennis instructed doctors to take his wife off life support. According to Dennis, his wife committed suicide. He claimed he found 2 bottles of antifreeze in the garage and assumed that Susan had drunk the antifreeze at some point. When asked why his wife committed suicide, Dennis told police that he and Susan had been fighting for quite some time. Susan was drinking while on antidepressant medication for depression and threatened to kill herself many times. Dennis also claimed he slept the entire night and woke up to find Susan unresponsive. According to the coroner's report, Susan died of a combination of ethylene glycol poisoning and oxycodone intoxication. Ethylene glycol is the main ingredient in antifreeze, so her death has been ruled a suicide. However, the strangest thing in this case was that no evidence in the bedroom showed Susan harmed herself. Detectives found no suicide note, no glass with antifreeze remnants of liquid in it, and no prescription bottles or antifreeze containers, an impossible scenario regarding the probability of suicide. Although Susan's death was already deemed a suicide and the case was closed, the Winters family was not ready to accept that she chose to take her own life. In 2016, Susan's parents, Danny and Avis Winters, hired retired FBI detective and attorney Tony Sergo, who filed a civil lawsuit against Brent Dennis on their behalf. Apparently, the suit alleges that Susan died under suspicious circumstances and blames her demise on Dennis, who had a financial motive. Indeed, Dennis was very keen on the financial benefit that originated from his wife's death. He stood to benefit from a $1 million life insurance policy taken out on Susan's life. He was also the beneficiary of Susan's inheritance worth $1 million. Within 2 days of his wife's death, he was in talks with the insurance company. Apart from monetary benefits, Brent Dennis had a much darker secret. The more Sergo dug deeper, the more Dennis looked like a suspect. Sergo found many clues that have never been looked at before, clues that paint another picture of this respected Nevada psychologist. In his own investigation, Detective Sergo discovered significant evidence against Dennis, including a substance abuse addiction and a connection to a man named Jeffrey Crosby, who had a past conviction of selling cocaine. During his civil deposition, Dennis admitted to buying drugs from Crosby.
What was the mechanism through which he would purchase controlled substances from Jeffrey?
Pay him cash and he would provide me substance.
When the secret was out, Susan was mad. The situation deteriorated in such a way that Dennis had to seek treatment for his drug abuse. Phone records showed 6 calls and texts from Susan's phone to Crosby's phone in the days before her death. She allegedly called Crosby to inform him she was going to the authorities. Susan wanted her husband to stop using drugs. But the addiction did not stop there. It was revealed that Susan had previously threatened to report his alleged drug use to authorities. Cell phone records obtained by the family lawyers showed she called and sent text messages to Crosby several times in the days before her death to stop him from selling drugs to Dennis. Interestingly enough, she confided in some friends that her marriage was falling apart the day before she died. Avis and Danny insisted Susan did not kill herself. According to her parents, she was a bit upset, but in no way did that lead to her committing suicide. In fact, Susan purchased airline tickets to San Jose, California, Atlanta, and Hawaii to attend her daughter Anna's cheerleading competitions. Susan's parents said she was really excited that Anna would be attending college. Dennis had previously claimed that Susan had searched for antifreeze several times before her death, which made him believe that she took her own life by consuming antifreeze. But months later, investigators discovered that the last of the searches for antifreeze poisoning was done at 5:15 a.m., when Susan was already unconscious and nearly dead. Dennis also traveled to Orleans to meet with Crosby on 4 occasions after her death between January 9, 2015 and March 27, 2015. After consistent insistence from the Winter family and with newfound clues, detectives decided to revisit the case. In February 2017, during a traffic stop near his home, Dennis was arrested on suspicion of open murder with a deadly weapon. Allegedly, he received prescription painkillers from his own patients. Interestingly, even at the time of his arrest, he had 3 painkiller pills in his right pocket. He was formally charged with voluntary manslaughter after being taken into custody. In April 2017, Susan's manner of death was changed from suicide to undetermined following Dennis's arrest. While Dennis remained free on $250,000 bail, he entered an Alford plea in which he does not admit guilt but concedes that prosecutors have sufficient evidence to prove his guilt. 4 years after Susan's tragic demise, Dennis was finally sentenced to serve 3 to 10 years in prison for voluntary manslaughter in connection with the 2015 death of his wife. While the Winters family is relieved by the outcome, Susan's daughters, who are now 22 and 20 years old, stood by their father. In a statement in court, they wrote that their father only entered the Alford plea in the case to avoid the harsher punishment, but had nothing to do with their mother's death. Whatever the outcome is, Susan's parents expressed their grief over losing contact with their granddaughters. While Susan is never coming back, hopefully the two families can find their way back to each other through the healing process. Barbara Jepson. Barbara Jean Jepson, a newly married 18-year-old, started her new life with her husband, Joe Jepson, in a lovely home in Van Nuys, California. As a National Air Guard, Joe earned a good living, so it's not a surprise that they planned to extend their families soon after marriage. They married in 1955, and Barbara conceived her first child that same year. By January of 1956, Barbara was in her 4th month of pregnancy. January 31st, 1956 was a normal day when Joe left his home for work early in the morning. Feeling bored at home, Barbara went shopping later in the day. Locals saw her around 12:30 p.m. She returned home soon after. When Joe returned home from work, a bloody scene awaited him. In the bedroom, Joe discovered Barbara's naked body on the mattress with a 10-inch butcher's knife stuck in her chest. Joe covered his wife with a blanket and then called the police. As detectives reached the crime scene, they found several items of evidence. A military green jacket with blood traces was found a few feet away from Barbara's body. Some hair follicles from an unknown person were also found in the garage. However, important items such as bedsheets, pillow covers, and a bloody rug found in the sink were not collected, since DNA technology was not available back then. The body was sent for examination, and reports came back stating that she'd been killed sometime between 1 p.m. and 4 p.m. It was also mentioned that she had been sexually assaulted before being brutally stabbed to death. The crime scene showed no forced entry, no stolen items, nor any signs of struggle, which led investigators to believe that she might have known her attacker. Upon questioning neighbors, 2 witnesses came forward. One person said he saw a person who did not live in the community roaming around the area that day wearing a green jacket. Another witness saw a man with big hands and big knuckles. Barbara was considered another victim of a series of sexual assaults that were going on in the nearby area. Police questioned every person who had committed crimes like this in the area, but could not link anyone to Barbara's murder. They initially suspected her husband, Joe, but he was eventually ruled out, as it was proven that he was at work during the murder. With no suspects, detectives reached a dead end. Despite combing through the evidence over the years, the search for Barbara's killer would remain unsolved and her case would remain cold. In 2016, DNA testing was completed on multiple items collected from the crime scene, but there was not enough DNA to submit the findings to the CODIS system for a match. Moreover, the suspect's DNA had most likely never been entered into the CODIS system. By 2019, Los Angeles police detective Rachel Evans had joined the cold case unit. The very first case assigned to her was Barbara Jepson's case. She set off re-examining the leads and looking for clues to identify the killer, which no detectives had been successful in doing for the past 60 years. It took her a whole week to read the entire case file the first time, yet she kept reading it again and again. By the 3rd time, she picked up on a few things that had not been given much importance by previous investigators. She noted the fact that there was no sign of forced entry, which suggested that Barbara most likely knew her killer. No items were taken from the scene, pointing towards the motive not being robbery. Based on the assumption that Barbara knew her assailant, Evans started putting the pieces together and focused her investigation on one person, Monty Mertz. Born in 1911 in Utah, Mertz had several relationships over the years. He first got married to Cleo Ream in 1931, with whom he had 1 son and 1 daughter, but that marriage fell apart. After the divorce, he married another woman named Bernice, but that marriage also did not last long. In 1945, during the divorce, Bernice cited cruelty as a cause. Indeed, Mertz was a violent person. He was also a gambling addict, womanizer, animal torturer, and a raging alcoholic, an absolute degenerate to say the least. And yet, women kept falling for him. In 1948, he moved in with a woman named Fern Spiva in the San Fernando Valley after making her his common-law wife. He stayed with her for 6 years. Spiva had a 10-year-old daughter from a prior relationship. That daughter was Barbara. Evans believed he groomed and molested Barbara along the way because that was one of his sick habits. He'd marry these young women who had young girls and then abuse them. In 1955, the year that Barbara got married, Mertz married another woman, his fourth wife, who already had 2 children, including a young daughter. In 1960, 15-year-old Marianne Pedrada, who had a horse stable next to Mertz's house and often rode horses with him, was stabbed 9 times and killed. But no one was linked to the murder. Then, in 1962, Mertz married his 5th wife, Ina. She too had a young daughter. In 1964, Mertz was arrested for molesting a 14-year-old girl. Although Mertz was suspected of multiple sexual assaults, that was the only victim for which he was arrested. That same year, Mertz showed up at a hospital with a gunshot wound. He claimed he was injured in an accidental shooting, but others believed someone intentionally shot him. Although investigators never discovered who shot Mertz and why, people around Mertz believed that it was most likely from a confrontation regarding Mertz's past abusive behavior, as well as the possible connection to the murders of Barbara Jean Jepson and Marianne Pedrada. In 1965, after his arrest for child abuse, Mertz was given a polygraph test by police who asked him about both the murders of Barbara Jepson and Marianne Pedrada. He denied ever knowing Barbara, but later it was discovered that he had attended her funeral and often visited her mom even after Barbara's death. Evans said the polygraph test results concluded that Mertz had definite guilty knowledge regarding the fate of the 2 murdered women. But Mertz could not be prosecuted with this alone, as polygraph test results are not admissible evidence in court. However, after this, suspicion mounted, and people started to notice that there was something wrong with him. One of the people who had suspected him was his own wife, Ina. She found the underwear of a young girl in a drawer in their house. On August 15, 1965, while he was out of jail, she confronted Mertz about whether he had been abusing the girl whose underwear he had. Suspicions already looming over him, this confrontation was the last straw, as Mertz then grabbed a gun and chased Ina outside to the street, shooting her multiple times and killing her. Afterwards, he returned to the house and killed himself. This murder-suicide would be the last depraved act in his pathetic criminal life. It was revealed that in 2017, a former stepdaughter of Mertz came forward to tell a shocking story. On the day that 15-year-old Pedrada was murdered, the then 10-year-old girl saw Mertz come back into the house with a bloody knife and blood on his hands and clothing. She was so terrified of Mertz that she waited 50 years to come forward with this information. Mertz apparently abused the girl physically and mentally by doing such things as stabbing her horse with a pitchfork. Despite being in her 60s, she said that the memories of Mertz still haunt her, and she's still afraid of him. Upon more digging, Evans learned that Mertz had a pattern of never leaving his victims alone, even after he remarried or when his stepdaughters grew up and moved out of the house. He would continue to abuse and sexually assault them until the time of his death. After some tiring research, Evans was able to track down Mertz's relatives still living in Utah. In September 2019, a search warrant for DNA was served on Mertz's 87-year-old son. Before the warrant, detectives were considering exhuming Mertz's body, but they were hopeful that the case could be solved by collecting his son's DNA. The son died just 2 weeks after giving his DNA to the detectives. Although there was not enough DNA to present, there was enough of a match to allow the cold case to be solved as per the standards of law enforcement, with 99% certainty that Mertz was Barbara's killer. He was also suspected of other murders and assaults. Evans said he would be charged with first-degree murder if he were still alive. Although many of the people directly affected by this tragic murder have long since passed, the pursuit of the American dream draws many from far and wide. For Shu Ming Tang, it was a chance to give his family a better life. However, that dream was snuffed out on the afternoon of April 26, 1993. Tang, a husband, father, and well-liked member of the San Carlos community, emigrated from Taiwan to California. A businessman at heart, Tang opened up a little mom-and-pop corner shop called the Devonshire Little Store. It was a hit with the community, and Tang was a welcoming and friendly store owner. The little shop thrived as the community grew to know and like the owner Tang. In a way, the corner shop that had always been a fixture in that part of town took on a new personality under the ownership of Tang, and it shocked the community when they learned that Tang had been shot and killed in the very store he'd owned. On the afternoon of April 26, 1993, San Carlos police officers responded to a 911 call for a possible shooting. Upon arrival minutes after the incident, officers found Tang, the store owner, bleeding out after sustaining a single gunshot wound. Emergency medical personnel rushed Tang to a nearby hospital. He, however, succumbed to his injuries soon after arriving at hospital. In the meantime, investigators were collecting information as eyewitnesses came forward to report that an adult female was seen fleeing the store soon after the shooting. She was described to be in her 20s, with shoulder-length brown hair. The car she was driving was a 70s blue station wagon. Allegedly, Tang had been alone in the store when the incident occurred. Investigators maintained that the shooting was the result of a robbery gone wrong and were pursuing leads regarding the woman seen leaving the crime scene. The case received national attention and featured on America's Most Wanted. Although much attention was garnered by the crime, leads dried up for investigators. A reopening of the case in 2010 brought nothing new to the table. 8 years later, in 2018, it was an utter stroke of luck that brought the killer to justice. Oklahoma authorities were investigating an unrelated crime and stumbled upon a diary in a rural home in the town of Dewey, north of Tulsa. There they found a private journal titled, "Things I Regret." In it was an account of the slaying of a Korean man during a robbery in San Carlos in 1993. The owner of the diary, 61-year-old Rain Hoffman Ramos. She had been living in the rural house when police conducted the search. Another search was conducted at a residence in Sacramento by California officials on March 16, 2022. The searches, which were conducted simultaneously between California and Oklahoma, yielded supporting evidence against Hoffman Ramos. Records showed that Hoffman Ramos was a repeat offender that had been arrested multiple times on drug-related and other non-violent offenses. She was arrested and detained in Oklahoma, awaiting extradition to California. Although the diary mentions a Korean man, Tang was Taiwanese. The details matched the scenario that the investigators developed at the crime. Hoffman Ramos waived her rights to an extradition hearing and was brought back from Oklahoma to California, where she made a brief appearance in San Mateo County Court on April 13, 2022. She was arraigned in court on April 26, 2022, 29 years to the date of Tang's murder. Hoffman Ramos was charged with murder in the death of Shu Ming Tang. Sheriff's Lieutenant Jacob Trickett said that the purpose of a cold case unit was to have a fresh perspective and to utilize more updated information management systems. "That's basically one of the reasons we were led back to Rain," he said. In July 1993, 3 months after the shooting, Tang's wife sold the store to another Taiwanese family. It had been a staple corner store for 87 years and remains open under new owner Chung Sun and his wife Ann Sun. Sun, who knows the family, said he still had questions about what took place. "What happened 30 years ago? What did she do?" he asked regarding the suspect. "This gentleman never did a bad thing to any people," Sun told ABC7. San Carlos Mayor Sarah McDowell made a statement following the arrest of Hoffman Ramos. "Mr. Tang was a husband, a father, and a friend who came to the United States to provide a better life for his family. His death shook the community of San Carlos and has remained a topic of discussion over the years." The Tang family have not spoken publicly, but authorities have been keeping them updated on the case and its proceedings. Sheriff Carlos G. Bolanos thanked the Tang family for their support over the years. The San Mateo County Sheriff's Office would like to thank the Tang family for their support. "I hope that your family will finally get the justice and closure that you deserve," he said to the Tangs. Patricia Stichler. Patricia Ann Stichler was born on June 5, 1954, in Toledo, Ohio. She went by the name Patty to her loved ones and friends. In 1985, after having a divorce just a year earlier, 30-year-old Patty was a mother to 3 daughters, whom she lived with on the 5,000 blocks of Brenthaven Road in Sylvania, Ohio. Her eldest daughter, Andrea, was 11, middle daughter Kristen was 9, and the youngest, Elise, was just 5 years old at the time. By all accounts, they were growing up in a safe neighborhood. Patricia was the first female manager of the 21st Century Health Spas and worked there for more than 7 years. It was New Year's Eve. After dinner, Patty had put her 3 young daughters in bed when multiple calls came in. When Patty would pick up the phone, the person on the other end kept hanging up. This happened several times that night. When Andrea woke up the next morning, she could not find her mother. That is, until she came to the hallway and witnessed a horrific scene. Her mother's lifeless body was lying on the floor in a pool of blood. She was mostly nude. Panicking, she called her father, who then called the police. As police went to the scene, they found Patty's throat had been brutally slashed with many other injuries on her body. Investigators would not find signs of forced entry on any doors or windows, but there were knife cuts on the shower curtain and window coverings in the bathroom, where a window was found open. Blood splatters were discovered on the walls of 2 rooms. Blood was also found on the bed and the carpets. A DNA sample was collected from the scene. The most shocking part was that while Patty was being attacked, her 3 daughters slept just a few feet away in another bedroom, but they were left unharmed. An autopsy revealed that the young woman put up a brave fight, which led to the wounds on her hands and arm, but she was no match to the intruder, who had a knife in hand and inflicted 19 stab wounds upon her. A few stab wounds to her abdomen were caused after she was dead. Investigators believe the assailant broke into the house through the bathroom window. She was most likely being watched before the attack, but they could not determine whether the assailant previously knew her or not. An unknown male DNA profile was developed from the evidence collected at the crime scene. Both Patricia's ex-husband and her boyfriend at the time were investigated extensively and ruled out early on in the investigation. Patricia's daughters swore to do everything in their power to bring justice to their mother. Through the years, they actively worked with the investigators in the case, which went cold pretty much after the first year of the murder. Andrea does not have a recollection of the fateful day due to the extreme trauma she went through after finding her mother in that state. When Rich Schnorr became the chief of the Sylvania City Police Department, he prioritized the Patricia Stichler case because this was the only unsolved homicide in the city. Among the 3 homicides that occurred in the town, the other 2 were solved pretty quickly. In 2018, a genetic genealogist built a family tree of the suspect from the DNA that was preserved for all these years and came up with some distant relatives, which then led to a biological mother. But she had given up the suspect for adoption, so the genealogists had to trace even further. Finally, all of their hard work would pay off, and the suspect was identified as Michael Mellis. Michael was just 17 years old at the time of the murder and lived only 6 houses down from Patty. He joined the Army after graduating from high school, while his family left the community shortly after the murder, as did Patty's. Although he was so close, investigators never had him on the radar for Patty's murder. Patricia's family was shocked to hear this news. Finally, they had the closure they'd wanted for so long. The pain was irreversible for Patty's daughters, but they finally knew who took their mother from them after 37 long years of uncertainty. However, it was bittersweet, as Michael could not be brought to justice. As it turned out, in 1989, just 4 years after Patty's murder, Michael would die in a single-car road accident while stationed in North Carolina. Despite this, Patty's middle daughter, Kristen, now 46, has a sense of peace knowing who killed her mother and that he can no longer hurt anyone. On a snowy night in Colorado, officers rescued a man who had gotten his truck stuck in the snow on the treacherous Guanella Pass high in the Rocky Mountains. Unbeknownst to them, they just rescued a criminal that they would spend the next 40 years searching for. What crime did he commit? Welcome back to Mysterious 7, where we shed light on under-the-radar cases from across the globe. Today, we'll discuss a cold case finally solved after 40 years of searching for a man that was rescued on the very night of the crime. Without any further ado, let's get into it. This case takes us to Colorado, specifically around Guanella Pass, high in the Rocky Mountains. Guanella Pass is best known for its ski resort and hiking trails. It's a generally peaceful place, but this was not the case on January 6, 1982. That day brought a brutal winter storm to Colorado and became unforgettable to many in the state. On the evening of January 6, 1982, 29-year-old Barbara Oberholzer, also known as Bobby Joe, called her husband Jeff Oberholzer after work to let him know that she was going to be late. A couple of friends had invited her for drinks, so she was going to be out for a while. She also told Jeff that she'd make her way home by hitching a ride. Hitchhiking was very common in Breckenridge in those days. Jeff and Bobby Joe didn't live in Breckenridge. They lived in Alma, which was about a 30-minute drive from Breckenridge. After falling asleep waiting for Bobby Joe, Jeff suddenly awoke and checked the time. Bobby Joe definitely should have been home by then because she did not normally stay out very late. Jeff got into his truck and went straight to the pub where Bobby Joe said she'd be. Her friends were surprised to see Jeff, and they told him that Bobby Joe had left much earlier. That was when Jeff knew something was wrong. He went to the police that night and reported his wife missing, but officers didn't file a missing person report. In those days, it was customary to wait at least 24 hours before filing a missing person report for an adult. Thankfully, this is no longer the case. On the same night, a plane heading to California flew over Guanella Pass. On the plane was a Colorado sheriff, Harold E. Bray, who looked out the window and saw something that caught his attention. It was flashing lights. Being a sheriff, Harold quickly understood that the lights were a distress signal. He alerted the pilot, who noted the coordinates and informed the Federal Aviation Administration. Soon, rescuers were able to locate the flashing lights and found a pickup truck that had gotten stuck in the snow. In the truck was a 30-year-old man named Alan Lee Phillips. Alan had gotten stranded while trying to cross the Guanella Mountain Pass. He was traveling without snow chains, which is why his truck got stuck in a snowdrift. Just when Alan had given up and thought he'd freeze to death in his pickup truck, he heard a plane flying overhead. Alan used his headlights to flash the SOS signal. But the officers became curious. When rescuers asked Alan why he was out there in the middle of the night, Alan said he was coming from a friend's place in Bailey and was heading home when he got caught in the snowstorm. His response satisfied the officers' curiosity, and they didn't find anything else suspicious. They simply gave Alan a lecture about preparing his vehicle for winter weather and subsequently dropped him off at home. The following day, Jeff received a call from a man telling him that Bobby Joe's driver's license was found on his property. He drove over there and picked it up. Jeff then gathered his friends, and together they started searching for Bobby Joe along the highway. Soon, Jeff spotted a blue backpack in the snow. They pulled over to have a closer look, and there they saw Bobby's glove with a splatter of blood and several tissues also soaked in blood. At that point, authorities were notified of the findings, and Jeff was sent home to wait while law enforcement and volunteers continued the search. Eventually, Bobby Joe's body was found off of Highway 9 near the summit of Hoosier Pass. After her body was examined, it was revealed that she was shot twice in the chest. Her wrists were tied with a plastic cord, and there were shell casings at the scene. During the search, Bobby Joe's belongings were found scattered far and near. Along with her body, they found a set of keys and an orange sock. Though the keys were identified to be Bobby Joe's, the orange sock, however, was not. On the same day, a 22-year-old woman named Annette Schnee was reported missing. Her disappearance was reported when she failed to show up at work. Annette worked at Breckenridge Holiday Inn and lived in Blue River. The last time anyone saw Annette was at a pharmacy in Breckenridge on January 6, 1982. According to those who saw her before she went missing, she planned to hitchhike home to change her clothes to get ready for her next shift, as she often did. But after she left, she was never seen again. What happened to Annette? Who killed Bobby Joe? Were the two connected? The officers began their investigations and were open about their suspects. They had set their eyes on Jeff Oberholzer, although no evidence connected him to the crime. Investigators found it suspicious that Jeff had no alibi to back up his claim that he was sleeping at the time of Bobby Joe's murder. Jeff was interviewed multiple times for both Bobby Joe's death and Annette's disappearance. Initially, Jeff told officers that he didn't know Annette, but later called to let them know that he had given Annette a ride months before she went missing. He said he was reminded of Annette's face as he'd been seeing her pictures a lot on the news. The officers were not satisfied yet. They asked Jeff to take a polygraph, which he passed. He'd always maintained his innocence, as well as annoyance with investigators insisting on his involvement. The investigation continued for months with no new leads. Exactly 6 months later, Annette's body was found on July 6, 1982, in a rural area in Park County, 20 miles from where she was last seen. She'd been shot once in the back. Annette had been sexually assaulted, and it seemed that she may have been redressed by the perpetrator or forced to redress, as her clothing was in disarray. She was noticeably missing an orange sock, which looked like the one found with Bobby Joe's body. After the examination of the two murders, investigators believed that a single person committed both crimes. They estimated that Annette was picked up around 5 p.m. on January 6, 1982, and driven to the remote area where she was sexually assaulted and murdered, possibly in an attempt to stop her from escaping. The unknown suspect then went back to Breckenridge, where he found his second victim, Bobby Joe, and abducted her. Bobby Joe was not sexually assaulted, but was shot twice in the chest, which made investigators believe that she might have been trying to have a conversation with her attacker when she was shot. According to Jeff, Bobby Joe would never accept a ride from a total stranger, which made him believe that someone who lived in the area and knew Bobby Joe had committed the crime. By 2015, over 100 suspects had been investigated, and at the time it was believed that the person responsible for the murders had Park County connections. Other suspects included a cab driver who had assaulted a hitchhiker in 1982, and while in jail, had bragged to a cellmate about committing 2 murders and getting away with it. 2 other persons of interest were the woman that had been talking to Annette before her abduction, as well as a man whose photograph was found in her wallet. Neither was ever identified nor questioned. About 10 suspects were thoroughly investigated and had their DNA collected. Investigators also worked with 2 psychics, but their combined efforts did not lead to any breaks in the case. Eventually, the case went completely cold since none of the suspects could be definitively tied to the murders. Years later, Jeff was finally cleared by DNA evidence after years of suspicion. Since the time of the tragic murders, the case has been handled by numerous agencies over the years and was featured on the television show Unsolved Mysteries in 1993 and again in 2007 on the Discovery Channel's Sensing Murders. However, in 1995, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation Denver Crime Laboratory conducted DNA testing to determine if the bloody glove and tissue that belonged to Bobby Joe contained Bobby Joe or Annette's DNA. Results indicated that blood on the glove and tissue didn't belong to either of them. In 2021, the case was put forward by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for Genetic Genealogy. After extensive searching through databases, a forensic genealogist analyst with United Data Connect was finally able to name Alan Lee Phillips, who was known to officers, as one of the 2 possible matches to the genetic profile obtained from Bobby Joe's glove. Investigators found that Alan had resided in Colorado since the early 1970s, and that he lived in Fairplay, Denver, Idaho Springs, and Georgetown before moving to Dumont. In early January 2021, officers placed Allen under surveillance, and on February 20th, surveillance indicated that Allen went to a Sonic drive-thru in Littleton and then to the Dumont post office. There, Allen threw away a brown bag inside the post office that was retrieved by police and taken to the DNA laboratory at CBI Denver. On February 23rd, the DNA samples from the brown bag were tested and found to be consistent with genetic profiles developed from the glove and tissue that belonged to Bobby Joe. Finally, on February 24, 2021, Allen was arrested and taken to the Park County Jail where he awaited his trial. On March 22, 2021, Allen was charged on multiple counts, including first-degree murder and second-degree kidnapping for both Annette and Bobby Joe. The trial began on August 29, 2022, in Park County District Court. Park County Detective Sergeant Wendy Kipple and Park County Special Deputy Charlie McCormack, who have both been key components in the prosecution of the case, gave their testimonies in the trial. The testimonies included strange occurrences on the night of the murder. According to Park County Sheriff Tom McGraw, Allen got stuck on Guanella Pass on the night of the murders, and they found the back of his vehicle submerged in the snow with his headlights pointing upward. David Montoya, a fire chief with the Empire Fire Department, was one of the first responders to Allen's situation and drove him home. He said he noticed a cut on Allen's forehead and blood on his jacket. According to McGraw, that incident had an impact on the trial because it placed Phillips in the area of 285, where pertinent evidence was located. This was not the first time Allen had trouble with the law. He was once arrested for burglary and assault in 1973. Though the 1973 case could not be used in the trial, it showed Allen's track record of assault. In the 1973 incident, Allen picked up a female hitchhiker coming out of Breckenridge, took her to a cabin off County Road 1, dragged her out of his vehicle, and beat her in the head with a rock. According to McGraw, who narrated the event, the woman screamed for him to stop and cried out, "I have a baby girl." Allen then broke into the cabin, cleaned her up, and dropped her off in Fairplay. The woman went to the police to report the harrowing incident. Allen was arrested and he confessed to the whole crime back in 1973. The night Allen was arrested in 2021, McGraw noticed some interesting occurrences that he shared in court. En route to the Park County Jail in Fairplay, with Allen seated in the back of a patrol vehicle, they passed the intersection where Allen picked up one of the victims in Breckenridge. They also passed the murder scene on Hoosier Pass, as well as the site where he dumped Annette's body in Sacramento Creek. McGraw recalled Allen complaining that he felt like he was going to be sick on 3 occasions at each of those 3 locations. He said he gagged, but he never threw up, but he was impacted by his return to each of those places. On September 15, 2022, after just 5 hours of deliberation, a jury convicted Allen Phillips on all 8 charges in the murders of Annette Shee and Bobby Joe Oberholzer. When Allen committed the murders, he was 31 years old, and even though he had once assaulted a hitchhiker, no one connected the dots. He was never a suspect in either case. He continued living his life normally. He got married and had children with no one chasing him. It was 39 years of freedom, according to Annette's sister, who said, "You had 39 years of freedom, and hopefully now it will all be taken away from you. 39 years of freedom too long." Allen Phillips, who's now 71 years old, faces life in prison. He'll be formally sentenced on November 7th, 2022. With the help of genetic genealogy and some very determined investigators, justice for Bobby Joe and Annette will finally be served after 40 years. Tanna Togstad and Timothy Mumbure. Tanna M. Togstad was born on August 20th, 1968, in New London, Wisconsin. Tanna had one older sister, Veronica, and one older brother, Richard. 2 years after Tanna's birth, a younger brother, Jeffrey, was born. Unfortunately, their father David died in 1985. The family was distraught, but Tanna did not let the sadness overcome her. In 1987, she graduated from New London Senior High School. After graduation, she started working as a machine operator at Cherney Company Incorporated in Weyauwega, Wisconsin. Although Tanna loved her family, it was time to start her own life. In 1991, Tanna, 23, started dating 35-year-old Timothy Mumbure and moved out to a farmhouse on Butternut Ridge Road in Royalton in Wapaka County. Even after leaving home, Tanna stayed close to her family. Veronica and her husband lived in a mobile home just next to Tanna. Richard's house was only 1.5 miles away from Tanna's farmhouse, which she shared with Timothy and her dog. On March 20th, 1992, Tanna and Timothy enjoyed an evening at LD's Bar in Clintonville in Wapaka County. It was between 11:30 p.m. and midnight when they left the bar and headed home. As the dawn broke, around 4 a.m. on March 21st, 1992, Veronica woke up to a noise and saw a suspicious truck backing out of her sister's driveway and heading west. However, she did not think much of it. The following day, nobody heard anything from Tanna and Timothy, so the authorities were called to do a welfare check at the farmhouse that the couple shared. On the afternoon of March 22, 1992, Wapaka County Sheriff's Office Detective Donald Berglund conducted the welfare, which ended in a grim discovery. Inside the bedroom, he found Tanna Togstad, Timothy Mumbure, and their dog. All three had been brutally stabbed to death. Numerous print impressions were discovered at the crime scene, some of them in the blood of the victims. However, no weapons were located at the scene. Both Tanna and Timothy's families were devastated to hear the news. They stated that neither Tanna nor Timothy had any enemies, and they had no idea who could have committed the atrocious act. The bodies were taken to the medical examiner's office for further inspection. After the autopsies were done, it was revealed that Timothy was stabbed multiple times while he tried to defend himself. He had numerous injuries on his neck, head, and chest, with various perforations of the heart and lungs. On the other hand, Tanna died from a single stab wound to the chest that penetrated her left lung. The only physical evidence of the killer that police found was the bodily fluid found on Tanna's body. However, when the DNA was tested, there was no match present in the criminal database. For years, authorities worked on potential leads, interviewed hundreds of people, and even took DNA samples from possible suspects. But nothing ever came of it, and the case eventually grew cold. In 2013, a person of interest was identified. A man named Glendon Gauker, who was already charged with the killing of a man and rape of his girlfriend in 1990. But he was never officially charged with Tanna and Timothy's murder. As Tanna and Timothy's families wondered about the culprit, without solid leads, the case turned cold. Over the years, there were many false leads that led nowhere. The case finally reopened after a DNA sample was obtained from a pen used by the suspect during a traffic stop on July 6, 2022. Forensic tests showed that it was a complete match to the DNA found on Tanna Togstad's body. That man was 51-year-old Tony Haas, whom police had long suspected of the murder. Tony Haas was not a stranger to the Togstad family. Both families lived in the same community and knew each other well. However, he had a much deeper connection to the family. Haas was 7 when his father died in a snowmobile accident. He was racing with 2 other snowmobiles when the crash killed him, and Tanna's father was the driver of one of the other snowmobiles involved. On the night of the murder, Haas, 22 at the time, was drinking heavily and, for some reason, started thinking about his father's death 15 years earlier. According to his later statement, in a drunken stupor, he headed to the home of Tanna Togstad. It is not clear what intention he had behind the decision, but Haas claimed he did not intend to hurt anyone. Unfortunately, the actions he took did not align with that. When Tony was taken in for questioning, he initially denied any connection to the crime. But as the interview went on, he revealed that on the night of the murder, he had been going from bar to bar, drinking heavily by himself. He said that afterwards, he got nervous when he saw the murder on the news, remembering the snippets from the previous night. He claimed that he was afraid he had been involved, but could not remember the events clearly due to his drunken state. According to what investigators were able to piece together from his statement, inside the farmhouse, he got into a fight with Timothy and fatally stabbed him with a knife. As Tanna yelled, Tony punched her in the face and stabbed her in the chest, killing her. He again said he did not remember what happened that night clearly. When asked why he did not notify the authorities, he stated he did not want it to look like a planned attack. On August 12, 2022, Tony Hass was charged with first-degree premeditated murder and is currently being held on a bond of $2 million. Tanna's brother, Richard, said he was happy the culprit had finally been found. He stated that, while he didn't know Hass personally, he knew his family and felt bad for them. Tanna's mother, Helen, died at peace on August 14, 2022, after learning who was responsible for her daughter's untimely demise. Nadine Madger. In 1980, Mark and Nadine Madger were happily living with their infant son Daniel in the Willow Grove apartment building on Grove Avenue in Willoughby, Ohio. 25-year-old Nadine was a beautiful person inside and out. Standing at around 5 foot 2 inches tall and weighing around 110 pounds, Nadine had a beautiful smile that matched her brown hair and brown eyes. Nadine was a stay-at-home mom who enjoyed being a mother. She was very gentle in nature and prioritized her family over anything. The family of 3 was thriving after Daniel's birth when tragedy struck the Madger family. On January the 11th, 1980, Mark Madger returned home around 5 p.m. after a long day of work. He never imagined he would find a scene of sheer horror in his own apartment. He was shaken to his core to find his wife, Nadine, on the floor of the dining room. She had been stabbed more than 40 times with a butcher's knife that was still sticking out of her body. Their 6-month-old son was just a few feet away, playing in a playpen, unharmed. Devastated, Mark then called 911 to report the horrific incident. When the Willoughby Police Department detectives observed the crime scene, they concluded that there was no forced entry. This was not even a robbery case because nothing was missing from the apartment. The knife, which was the murder weapon, belonged to the Madgers. Another knife was also missing from the set. After the corpse was taken to the medical examiner's office, the reports revealed that, although no sexual assault occurred, the attacker had stabbed Nadine 40 times, which looked like a crime of passion. In the initial investigation, it was believed that Nadine was murdered sometime between 1:15 p.m. and 4:45 p.m. Around the same time, a neighbor reported observing a canary yellow Dodge Dart parked in the rear of their apartment complex. Not many clues were left at the crime scene, but the killer did leave something behind. The blood on Nadine's shirt played the most crucial part in the later part of the investigation. The perpetrator's blood suggested only one thing: he was somehow injured in the attack and had bled. Some of the killer's blood on Nadine's shirt was in the form of perpendicular drops, which suggested that the suspect was standing on top of Nadine while he was bleeding. A DNA profile was developed from the attacker's blood collected from Nadine's shirt. Police had some suspects on their list, and any suspect on the initial list that they could track down was interviewed and compared to that DNA profile, but with no luck. Unfortunately, the case went cold for years. The case reemerged in 2018 when the Willoughby Police Department started working with Virginia-based Parabon Nanolabs Incorporated, a DNA technology company that specializes in identifying suspects through their ancestry using genetic genealogy. The lab entered the suspect's DNA into 2 databases, GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. Once in those databases, it was compared to any registered user. Several matches were found, but were very distant cousins of the suspect. From there, they began to build a family tree of possible matches, leading them to a man named Stephen Joseph Simcak. He was a former U.S. Marine and resided in New York with his wife. He had no criminal history throughout his life. Between 1963 and 2002, he was a resident of Sunset Drive in East Lake, Ohio. Around the time of Nadine's murder, Simcak worked for Lincoln Electric Department. During his 36 years working for that company, he had only called in sick once, in 1980, the very day Nadine was murdered. It was also noted that, in 1980, he drove a canary yellow Dodge Dart, identical to the one spotted near the scene the day of the murder. Investigators tracked down and contacted one of Simcak's adult children in 2022. The man had absolutely no clue what his dad had done in his past, but agreed to provide them with a DNA sample. The sample was analyzed by Parabon Nanolab. After extensive examination, they came to the conclusion that it was Simcak who indeed murdered Nadine Madger in 1980. It was conclusively determined that his DNA was the same DNA that was discovered on Nadine's shirt. It's not known why this heinous crime was committed. Investigators do not have any information on whether Simcak knew her or if it was a targeted killing. Unfortunately, all these questions will forever linger as Simcak passed away from natural causes in 2018. Nadine's husband, Mark Madger, said that he has nothing against the Simcak family, but wants them to understand what kind of a person Simcak really was. He was quoted as saying, "If there's a hell, I know he's in it, and I hope he rots there."
If there's a place in hell, I know he's in it, and I hope he rots there.
Nadine's son, Daniel, now 42 years old, has also expressed anger because the culprit passed away as a free man without having to face justice. However, he's relieved that they can finally put a face and a name to his mother's killer. There's really nothing like waking up on a fresh spring day full of new possibilities. On lovely days such as this, the possibility of death should be the furthest thing from our minds. Unbeknownst to Robin Brooks, that was the exact fate she was facing. 20-year-old Robin Gisela Brooks was working as a clerk at a place called Donut Time, a pastry shop located on Kiefer Boulevard in Sacramento, California. On a lovely day in April 1980, Robin failed to show up for her 4 p.m. shift. It wasn't like her to not show up without giving notice, especially since she lived only a block away. Something wasn't right. A friend and coworker of hers went to check up on her at the apartment where she was living at the time. They knocked on the door several times, but there was no response. Had she gone out? Was she unable to come to the door? Or was it something more mysterious? No one knew. Hi, and welcome back to Mysterious 7, where we talk about under-the-radar cases from around the globe. And in today's episode, we're looking at the mysterious 40-year-old cold case of Philip Wilson that's finally been solved. Let's get into the mystery without any further ado. Robin had recently followed her sister to the West Coast, settling in Sacramento from Highland, New York about a half a year before. She was just starting her new life. It was the 24th of April, 1980 at midnight, when the workers at Donut Time were wrapping up for the day. Robin was working the late shift at the pastry shop. She was chosen to do the night shift as she only lived a block away. It was a usual night for her. After a last-minute check, she turned the keys and locked the shop. She followed her normal route, walking home to the country club apartments where she had moved in about 6 weeks prior. Later that day, she was scheduled to be back at work at 4 p.m. When she didn't show up, her colleagues grew concerned. She didn't know many people in the area yet, and they thought she could be in trouble. The last time they'd seen her, she was joyful as always, and everything seemed to be fine. A friend volunteered to go check up on her. They knocked on the door several times, but there was no answer from the other side. The dead silence gave them a foreboding feeling. Then they returned to the shop to find someone willing to break in. This might sound extreme, but they cared for their friend and just wanted to make sure that everything was okay. When they returned, they continued to bang on the door to no avail. Finally, they decided to break down the door. After they finally gained entry, they witnessed a horrifying scene. Robin was found on her waterbed in the bedroom. She had been stabbed multiple times. The killer was so brutal that he even stabbed right through her, puncturing the waterbed that her body lay upon. They wasted no time and called the police to report a murder. This was a very difficult case for the Sacramento homicide detectives. Brooks was new in the area and she didn't have many friends. She had no boyfriend. She'd been living in the apartment for only about 2 months, and all she did was the commute to work and back. In fact, she'd moved there to be closer to her job. She was still just getting settled into her new apartment, and even on the night of the incident, her coworker said Brooks joked about her bed not being made. This led police to believe she was murdered immediately after her shift. There were no leads to follow and no clues to investigate. They concluded the case was a murder with special circumstances. It was speculated that the murder happened in the course of a sexual assault. When they questioned Jolene Davis, the manager of the apartment Brooks lived in, she claimed that she wasn't the type to look for trouble and she hadn't done anything to attract any undue attention. Investigators were at a loss. This was just a normal girl minding her own business. She had no enemies or obsessive exes. Her neighbors were questioned and did not recall overhearing any disturbance that night. It's never easy to catch a random killer with no known ties to the victim. It was especially difficult in those days because DNA technology was not yet available. Police surmised that this was a possible case of a stalker, and sure enough, her colleagues were aware of a strange occurrence Brooks talked about. Brooks mentioned to them a very strange man, a customer at the restaurant who was very persistent. The man kept trying to get her attention, trying to talk to her in the days leading up to her murder. Investigators believed this man likely was involved. He may have been enraged at her for rejecting him. Unfortunately, Brooks never really described the man. This was before there were CCTV cameras everywhere. There was no way for investigators to know who this mystery suspect was, and the lead fizzled out. Detectives believed there was a high chance that the man was secretly following Brooks. How else would he know where she lived? Brooks had been working at the donut shop for 6 weeks, and the man who had been trying to get her attention might have been keeping an eye on her, watching her comings and goings. The attack seemed to have been planned and devised after careful observation. Fingerprints were found on the windowsill. It was theorized that the murderer must have entered the apartment through the window waiting for Brooks to return from work, and as soon as she entered and locked the door behind her, she was attacked and raped. The neighbors did not overhear any kind of disturbance, as she did not have any time to react. The intruder and attacker must have been a strong man, strong enough to overpower her. They believed the initial motive would have been a sexual assault, but if she recognized this man, he would also have to kill her. The incident likely happened in a rush. The brutality with which the crime was committed suggested a grudge murder, yet she had no known enemies. Investigators collected and sent blood evidence in for testing. Back in 1980, the information we could retrieve from the blood was limited. They could get the blood type, among other things, but not the intricate details. The investigation found that there was blood at the scene that did not match Brooks. This pointed to the murderer somehow cutting himself during the stabbing. Investigators now had 2 pieces of DNA evidence, from the blood of the murderer and his semen. Unfortunately, there wasn't much they could do with it at the time. In 1980, they had no way to process the DNA. There was no combined DNA index system or CODIS back in those days. It was available only after 1994, and what they had was very limited, only to be used by the FBI, usually to find missing people. Even the fingerprint testing system wasn't as efficient as it is now. AFIS, or Automated Fingerprint Automation System, although it existed, wasn't widely available until 6 years later in 1986. Despite the case being reviewed and worked on thoroughly, it went cold. The police closed Brooks's file and stacked it with the other cold cases. In the early 2000s, significant progress was made in DNA forensics and we began gathering data and creating a database for DNA comparison. These DNA databases were made available to law enforcement agencies across the country. This was an incredible breakthrough, yet if the DNA you were looking for had not been uploaded to the database because that person had never been arrested for a serious crime, then it was useless. The real break in this case, though, would not come until 2017, when the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office investigators got Parabon Nano Labs involved. The Parabon Nano Labs is a Virginia-based laboratory that offers forensic genealogy services. This technology can produce something called Snapshot, which is formulated by using DNA phenotyping to produce an unknown individual's ancestry and physical appearance. The investigation had a new lead. They had a scientifically rendered likeness of the person who killed Brooks. The technology was a success, and so the authorities reopened Brooks's file, and using the DNA profile developed by Parabon, they built a family tree for Brooks's killer. The police gave the news to the Brooks family, and their plea for justice was ignited again. The family then posted a column in the newspaper offering $10,000 as a reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the man. The newspaper article told of how the killer's DNA had been profiled to the Combined DNA Index System database, but it did not yield any matches. However, this article was published 37 years after the murder. 37 years is a long time, and memories fade quickly. People move away or pass away. The odds of someone remembering something for this new sketch were low, yet the family was hopeful. They say time heals, but how can one ever forget such a brutal crime? How can one live knowing that they've done something so terrible? Brooks's family had been suffering the loss for such a long time, and to know that the man who did this is free, and worse, could still be committing similar crimes, was agonizing. Maria Eric Brooks, Brooks's sister, still holds the guilt in her heart because Brooks followed her out to Sacramento. The police, however, were still working on the genetic angle. They had a family tree of the murderer, and through much research, they were finally able to narrow it down to one man. They compared the DNA in the blood and semen which they found at the crime scene, and they were a perfect match. The fingerprints were also a match. They finally had a name: Philip Lee Wilson. It was exactly 40 years to the day, April 24th, 2020, when Sacramento law enforcement officials announced that they'd finally arrested the man who raped and killed 20-year-old Robin Gisela Brooks. He was 31 years old at the time of the murder and lived in a rental home on Happy Lane, less than 2 miles from Brooks's apartment. He was 71 years old when he was arrested in his home in North Sacramento. When he was put before the court, the prosecutors pointed out that the DNA also matched the evidence in a rape case which occurred 3 weeks before the murder. Deputy District Attorney described Philip Wilson as a charismatic man who had a lot of friends. It's baffling to know a man who seemed so friendly could have those types of skeletons in his closet. Officials speculate that Wilson killed her just to fulfill a sick fantasy. The family waited exactly 4 decades before they found the man who had turned their lives upside down. It's interesting how life works. The guilty verdict came to him on his 72nd birthday. That's a birthday present he can cherish for the rest of his sad life. He'll be celebrating all of his birthdays in the future behind bars. Hopefully, the family finds some comfort in knowing this. Lindy Sue Biechler. Lindy Sue Little was born on January 31st, 1956. Lindy's parents separated when she was young, and she stayed with her mother. Her father remarried and had a little boy named Mike. Lindy and Mike were very close, and he has remained a steadfast advocate of his half-sister for over 35 years. Lindy and Philip Biechler were high school sweethearts. In October 1974, the couple got married, and Lindy officially became Lindy Sue Biechler. While attending college, Philip worked at a car rental store, and Lindy worked at a flower shop. They moved to a first-floor Manor Township apartment in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Everything seemed to be going fine, but Lindy could not shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She confided in her family that she felt very uncomfortable in that apartment. One time, she even saw someone peeking inside her room through the glass sliding door. On December 5, 1975, between 6:45 p.m. and 7:05 p.m., Lindy returned home from the grocery store. Around 8:45 p.m., Lindy's uncle and aunt dropped by her Manor Township apartment. When they entered the apartment, they discovered blood on the front door, the entranceway wall, and the carpet. Inside, Lindy was lying on her back, covered in blood, with a knife sticking out of her neck. Panic-stricken, they called the police immediately. When investigators reached the scene, they found blood all over the floor. They noticed the signs that a struggle had taken place. A butcher's knife was still stuck in Lindy's neck. The knife handle was wrapped with a tea towel. Interestingly, it matched the set of blades located in Lindy's kitchen. Traces of unknown DNA were collected from semen on Lindy's underwear and her pantyhose. Her body was then taken for autopsy. The autopsy report revealed that Lindy had been brutally stabbed a total of 19 times with 2 different knives. She had also been sexually assaulted. Police believe that the fatal wound came early on in the attack, yet the killer kept stabbing her. This is known as overkill and is usually associated with very high emotions during an attack. There was no indication of forced entry and no evidence of a robbery. Despite a bloody footprint at the scene, for a long time there was no new development in the case. Neighbors were questioned, but were not present at the time of the murder and could not provide any additional information. Police initially suspected Lindy's husband, but he was later ruled out. Around the 1-year anniversary of her death, Lindy's grave was defaced with red paint and chips to the gravestone from a sharp object. A letter soon followed claiming responsibility for both the vandalism and the murder. Police later determined that this was a hoax. In 1997, a DNA profile was developed. In 2000, it was uploaded to the CODES database, but no match was found and the case remained closed. Then, in January 2019, Manor Township Police Department handed the case over to the Lancaster County District Attorney's Cold Case Unit, which was formed in the same year. In June 2019, the unit reached out to Parabon Nanolabs to use their Snapshot Advanced DNA Analysis service to analyze the DNA found at the crime scene. In September 2019, the investigators released 2 different composites developed by Parabon based on the DNA evidence. These composites helped in sketching the suspect's appearance, including skin tone, eye color, and hair color. The images show the killer at 2 different ages and how he would have changed over the years, from 25 to 65. In 2020, C.C. Moore, the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, began digging deeper into the case by using genetic genealogy, which uses an unknown suspect's DNA to trace his or her family tree. She did not get a match right away. However, she was able to find very distant relatives. After months and months of scouring through documents, she was able to identify a suspect. It turned out that the suspect was hiding in plain sight all these years, and no one had a clue. It was David Sinopoli, a neighbor of Lindy who, at the time of her murder, lived in the same apartment complex. Yet police still needed to obtain a sample of his DNA to make an arrest. In February 2022, investigators tailed Sinopoli and recovered a coffee cup he had used and had thrown away at the Philadelphia International Airport. Reports from the labs later confirmed the DNA on Sinopoli's cup and DNA collected from the semen on Biechler's underwear and pantyhose were a match. Just as in Nancy Bennallack's case, the motive for the horrific murder remains unclear, and the only connection between the two was the apartment complex they both lived in. In July 2022, 68-year-old Sinopoli was arrested and charged with Lindy's murder. He's currently being held without bail at the Lancaster County Prison. It's a relief to all that with the help of genealogy, Lancaster's oldest cold case has finally been solved. Karen Stitt. 4 decades ago, on September 2nd, 1982, after spending the entire evening with her boyfriend in Sunnyvale, California, 15-year-old Karen Stitt went to catch a late-night bus back to her home in Palo Alto. Her boyfriend David could not accompany her the entire distance out of fear that his parents would be upset with them for staying out past curfew. After dropping her off in the El Camino Real and Wolf Road area, David left. From there, Karen walked toward the bus stop. David had no idea that it was the last time he would see her. The next day, a delivery man witnessed a horrific scene roughly 100 yards away from the bus stop and called the Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety to report it. He found the naked body of Karen Stitt, whose arms and feet were bound by her own clothing. The brutally assaulted body was concealed behind a blood-stained wall near the now-gone Honeybee restaurant. Closer inspection of the crime scene showed that the leaves and dirt around her feet had been disturbed, suggesting that she was still alive when her body was left there. Investigators believed that the murder was committed while the perpetrator was attempting a kidnapping. Detectives were shocked to witness the viciousness of the crime. After identifying the body and contacting the family, the corpse was taken to the medical examiner's office. The autopsy revealed that the 15-year-old girl had been sexually assaulted and fatally stabbed more than 60 times. Multiple stab wounds were found on her neck and chest areas. Although nobody knew who could have committed such a heinous crime, the murderer himself left his mark in the form of bodily fluids on Karen's body. During the initial investigation, David, the boyfriend, was a suspect, but he was quickly ruled out by DNA evidence. Investigators also came across a possible witness, a machinist who saw a suspicious old-fashioned truck parked with its parking lights on near the area where Karen's body was later found. Although detectives urged the public to come forward if they had information about Karen's murder or the truck, their search remained fruitless. They investigated other possible leads, but nothing ever came of those either. Sadly, days turned into months, and months turned into years, still with no significant developments made in the case. In 2000, a DNA profile was created from the DNA obtained as physical evidence at the crime scene and run through CODIS, the FBI's national database, but there were no matches. Amazingly, a valuable tip regarding Karen's murder came in after almost 40 years of silence. In 2021, Detective Matt Hutchison received a tip that pointed to one of 4 brothers from Fresno, California, as the murderer of Karen Stitt. Hutchison reopened the case and started his own investigation. By April of 2022, Detective Hutchison, using genetic genealogy, had ruled out all of the brothers except one. He zeroed in on 75-year-old Gary Ramirez. Detectives did not have access to Gary's DNA, as by then he was living in Hawaii. However, they were able to obtain a DNA sample from his child. In early 2022, the sample was sent to the lab for DNA analysis. The result identified Gary as the likely source of the DNA obtained from the crime scene. Detectives believe Gary kidnapped Karen from the Sunnyvale bus stop and then brutally raped and killed her before dumping her bloodied body nearby. Gary, a former bug exterminator, had no criminal history, which is why his DNA was not present in the CODIS database. On August 2, 2022, Gary Ramirez was taken into custody and charged with Karen Stitt's murder from his home in Maui, Hawaii. The date of his first court appearance is pending. If found guilty, he could face up to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After 40 years of uncertainty, Karen Stitt's family finally got the answers they had desperately wanted for so long. A single gunshot shattered the relative quiet of a spring night in Huntington, West Virginia. A shadowy figure dissolved into the darkness surrounding the alley. Police arrived to find a young woman brutally beaten with a single gunshot wound, barely clinging to life. The sensational case garnered much interest in the area for a time, but grew cold as leads dried up over the years. 30 years later, and several counties away, the mystery of the murder would come to light during the investigation of an unrelated crime. Who was responsible for murdering a young woman trying to build a new life for herself? Was she simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or did she know her killer? Welcome back to Mysterious 7. Today we're looking into the 30-year-old cold case of Melissa Martinez that was finally solved in 2022. If you haven't subscribed already, please consider subscribing, hit the like button, and click on the notification bell to get the latest content. Without any further ado, let's dive right into this mystery. Huntington, West Virginia sits at the western foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, providing a scenic landscape to visitors and residents alike. It's home to Marshall University, a public research university known for their football team, the Thundering Herd. It's located along the Ohio River and the mouth of the Wyandotte River, making it the second busiest inland port in the United States. The blend of colonial architecture and modern institutions provides an even blend of old town charm and modern living. It's in this town that 25-year-old Melissa Ann Martinez was hoping to build herself a new life. Melissa was presumed to have been born in either 1968 or 1969. Her mother lived in Las Vegas, Nevada. She had 3 siblings, 2 brothers and a sister who lived in the Huntington area, along with a niece. Melissa lived with a friend, Marie Sadler, in the 4600 block of Darnell Road in Huntington. Sadler said she'd started going to church and had a promising future ahead of her. According to a former assistant chaplain at Cabell County Jail, John Person, Melissa had rededicated her life to Christ just 2 months before her death. She'd confessed this to him while being detained for unknown charges. It's alleged that Melissa was a sex worker and had some minor run-ins with the law. There are no records that point to why she had turned to this occupation. It can only be assumed that Melissa had fallen on hard times and needed to find a means of supporting herself. She changed her name to Lisa Ann Estep. Her past forgotten, her new friends in Huntington became her family. Presumably, it was this line of work that ultimately led to her death down a darkened alley. In the early morning hours of March 16, 1993, witnesses reported a man beating a woman in an alley in the 1400 block between 4th and 5th Avenue in Huntington. After a single gunshot rang out, police were called to investigate the incident. There, police discovered a young woman desperately clinging to life on the sidewalk of the alley. She suffered multiple lacerations to her head and face and a single gunshot wound to her torso. Working against time, medical personnel rushed her to Cabell County Hospital. Unfortunately, their efforts were in vain as Melissa succumbed to her injuries shortly after arriving. An autopsy report provided by the medical examiner's office in South Charleston confirmed that Melissa was shot once in the chest and beaten about the head and face with a blunt object. Wasting no time, police canvassed the area and began looking for answers among the witnesses to the crime. A couple who lived in the area and knew Melissa said the shot rang out like a cannon and woke them from their sleep. Dozens of interviews were carried out, and police at the time did have a potential prime suspect. Witness statements pointed investigators towards Ricky Louie Woody. The 30-year-old man was interviewed by police. No clear link was found that could establish a connection between Woody and Melissa. No known relationship existed between the two. The lack of sufficient evidence did not allow for police to formally charge the man. He was released, but remained a person of interest. Meanwhile, the investigation dragged on. The hype created by the media in regard to the occupation of the victim followed investigators at every turn. The lack of progress in the case led many to believe that perhaps the police just weren't doing enough to solve the murder. In a 1993 interview with newspapers, Hunting Police Department Detective Carl Brooks said that the case was dependent on leads. Where we go from here depends on where the leads take us. Police, at the time, continued to investigate the murder of Lisa Ann Estep. They were unaware at that time that this was an alias. Only after a thorough investigation did investigators discover her legal name was actually Melissa Martinez. Upon discovering the true identity of the victim, police made contact with her family. Melissa's family requested anonymity for fear of being publicly shamed due to her occupation. In an anonymous interview with local newspaper The Herald Dispatch in 1993, one of her brothers said that they were never quite sure as to why Melissa chose to do sex work. He described it as her lifestyle. Although the family wished to remain anonymous, he expressed that he still loved his sister and voiced fears the police would let the investigation drop once the sensationalism surrounding the crime died down. I've already prepared my mother in Las Vegas for the fact that the people who murdered Lisa may never be found, he told the newspaper. After all, most people think she was trash. I hope the police don't think that, he said. The murder of Melissa created a stir. It was a sensational story centering around the murder of an alleged sex worker. News coverage angled their focus on the fact that Melissa was a sex worker rather than looking at the brutal murder of a young woman. For her friends, Melissa was being forgotten as a person and being made into a spectacle to up ratings. While her family shied away from media attention and scrutiny, her friends in Huntington mourned her passing publicly. An attempt was made to raise funds in order to put up a memorial for Melissa. Those closest to her reached out to the kindness of the community. Local papers carried articles surrounding the fundraising initiatives made by Melissa's concerned network of close friends. In honor of Melissa, they wanted to erect a gray granite memorial stone. This, however, never happened. A week later, a cross was nailed onto a utility pole adjacent to where her body was found in the alley. Inscribed on it were the words, "Don't let Lisa die in vain." Melissa's friend Ron Tillman remarked, "Lisa was like a family member to us. No one has anything to remember her by. We want to try and give her some dignity," he said. Lynn Ray and her husband Ed Luna, who lived in the alley where Melissa was murdered, said Melissa was a friend who did not deserve to be killed, no matter her lifestyle. She was sweet and kind of quiet. The only time I remember her working out here was before rent time. The makeshift memorial cross urged for action to be taken in Melissa's case. It was eventually removed, though, shortly after being put up. 7 days after her death, former jail chaplain John Person allegedly complained to newspapers that Melissa was not given a proper funeral despite surrendering her life to Christ once again. He fervently hoped the memory of a woman he called a sweet lady would not be swept under the rug. 8 days after her death, an unidentified spokesperson for Melissa's family said that they'd have her body cremated and sent to her mother in Las Vegas. The delay in making the arrangements was caused by the fact that the family had to prove Melissa was legally divorced so that they could assume responsibility for her remains to be released. As with many cold cases, leads went nowhere, and despite her friends trying to keep her memory alive, the case was soon shelved and her killer remained a mystery. The years flew by, but then, almost 3 decades later, interest was reignited in the long-forgotten case. In December 2020, an arrest was made in Billings, Montana that would lead investigators back to the events of March 16, 1993. A light was finally shone on the case of Melissa Martinez. A then 59-year-old Ricky Louie Woody was arrested following an unrelated charge in Big Sky Country. After leaving Huntington just a year after Melissa's murder, the long arm of justice eventually caught up to Woody. Woody was arrested following a domestic violence charge in December 2020. The woman who laid the charges alleged that he beat her with a bat, shoved her, broke her phone, and threatened to kill her. While incarcerated for the domestic violence charge, Woody allegedly asked people to tell the woman to recant her statements. Investigators in Billings began questioning Woody regarding the current case he was involved in when they stumbled across a bigger mystery. Woody gave police a statement about a murder that occurred in Huntington in the early 1990s. Initially, he claimed that he knew the person responsible for the murder of a woman named Lisa in Huntington. Upon further questioning, Woody provided what details he could recall. Ultimately, he admitted to being a participant in the murder. In May 2021, Billings police officers contacted the Huntington Police Department with regard to any possible cold cases they had that involved a woman named Lisa. One did pop up, the case of Melissa Martinez. Huntington police reviewed the cold case and found the links that for so long eluded them. Woody was the only possible suspect in the case during the initial investigation. Without the evidence they needed back then, they had no option but to let him go. investigators from Huntington made the trip to Montana and re-interviewed Woody in September 2021, where he was being held at the Yellowstone County Detention Facility for the domestic violence matter he'd been arrested for. Satisfied with the evidence, they returned to West Virginia with the confession they needed to link Woody to the murder of Melissa. There have always been signs that he was a primary suspect, but getting to this point, you really needed that information, and we finally received it, said Huntington Police Chief Carl Colder. The confession from Woody allowed Huntington Police to take the evidence they finally had to secure an indictment in the case of Melissa Martinez. In September 2022, Ricky Louis Woody was indicted by a grand jury in Cabell County. He was officially charged in October 2022. Woody has been charged with unlawfully, feloniously, willfully, maliciously, and deliberately slaying and murdering Melissa Martinez, who went by the name Lisa Ann Estep, in Huntington on the 16th of March, 1993. A spokesperson for the Cabell County Circuit County Judge Paul Farrell's office said that Woody still needed to face justice for the charges that led to his initial arrest back in Montana. Only then can he be extradited to West Virginia to answer for the murder of Melissa. He's currently being held in Montana on several felony charges, including being a fugitive from justice and assault with a weapon. His bond was set at $50,000. He's waived extradition to West Virginia, but will only be transferred once legal matters have been tied up in Montana. Philip W. Morrison, executive director of the West Virginia Prosecuting Attorneys Institute, was assigned as a special prosecutor for the case. He explained the scarcity of information boiled down to the case still being investigated and cited ethical rules about pretrial publicity, which he had to honor. A court appearance has been slated but not confirmed for November 2022, after which officials believe he'll return to West Virginia to face murder charges for the death of Melissa Martinez. At the time, Morrison did not know exactly when Woody would be extradited, only that they're not quite done with him out there, he said. Having worked with cold cases before and seen a few go to trial, the setbacks can be numerous, as memories typically fade over time, witnesses become unavailable, or evidence gets lost along the way. There is hope, though, as Morrison found that the cases he's worked, they often do get an evidentiary break that helps push the case in their favor. Following the arrest of Woody, Huntington Police Chief Carl Colder said that Melissa's family were informed of the breakthrough. He hoped that it gave them some sense of closure. He commended the hard work done by police that went into solving the case. Colder thanked both the Billings Police Department and Huntington Police Department for their ability to work together in seeing the case to its end. We want the public to know that we're not going to just shut down the case. We're going to continue to seek leads and investigations. That's what we did here, he said. Colder further added that families still awaiting answers in unrelated cold cases should not give up. The solving of Melissa's case should provide hope that justice will prevail and that it should give them the drive to keep going. It gives them hope that we're going to continue our efforts to investigate. We're going to also be vigilant in bringing those to justice who deserve to be brought to justice, said Colder. The cases for which Woody's been charged remain ongoing in both Montana and West Virginia. The solving of Melissa's case gives hope to many families who have suffered similar fates. It proves that no matter how long it's been, the answers to unsolved murders will be found, even in the most difficult of circumstances. Once again, dedication to the job and teamwork has proved that no stone will be left unturned in seeking the truth to unsolved crimes. What are your views on the solving of cold cases? Do you believe justice will eventually be served upon the one responsible for the crime sooner or later? Perhaps you or someone you know awaits the answers to a mystery that's plagued them for years. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And please subscribe to our channel. Until we meet again, stay safe and keep watching Mysterious 7.